Without further ado, I'm sure you're all anxious to hear from our presenter, Dr. Pat Fryman. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me way back there? Just fine? How about way back there? Yeah? Okay. Maybe I'll stick with this microphone. Hey, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. I actually prefer to introduce myself, and I already did that this morning. So now that we have that out of the way, I'll tell you what my intentions for this talk are. Really, I want to demystify the concept of anxiety. I think that the American Psychiatric Association, the American Psychological Association, possibly even the National Association for Social Workers have mystified the concept. Oh, man, thank you so much. How do I do this? Okay, this is one of the key treatment variables for anxiety. The key is exposure. I was just told my zipper's down. And so, bear with me because I got to pull it up. That's anxiety. So, I do actually some public speaking training for my interns and postdocs every year, and their first public speaking exercise is next Wednesday, and they're terrified. And there's nothing I can do about it. I tell them, I'll protect you, nothing will happen to you, I'll be right there beside you. The ratio of positive comments versus critical comments will be 90-10, maybe 95-5. It'll be just, you'll be bathed in complimentary comments, and they're still terrified. And so what I promised I would do for them is maybe do a little exercise before we get started to get them out of their heads and into their speeches. And I had thought that I'm from Montana, that I would just have them all stand in front of the room with me and do the can-can, sort of like singing the Montana State song. But instead, I think I should just have them pull their zippers down. It totally worked for me. So I want to demystify the concept of anxiety, and I also want to be its public relations officer, because it isn't necessarily a bad thing. Now, I know it probably isn't obvious to you, but I'm a very nervous speaker. I'm actually terrified of public speaking. I know you can't tell, but you can't see my blood pressure. You can't see my heart rate. You don't know how much cortisol is in my saliva right now. And I guarantee you all those are elevated. And it's never going to go away. It's never going to go away. But there is a solution to this kind of a problem, and I'll mention it. But I'll tell you how bad it was. The first time I spoke to more than 3 people at one time was when I defended my master's thesis. There were 4 people. And it was harrowing. It was one of the worst experiences I've ever had in my life, not because of the research, and not because I did a bad study, but because I was so afraid of talking to 4 people at the same time. I got all the way through it. I almost wet myself. I thought I was going to throw up several times. My mouth was dry. I stuttered and stammered. I finally got all the way through it. And then when I got done, I resolved to end my graduate career. Not because the research was so difficult, but because I could envision 2 or 3 years from then having to defend my doctoral dissertation, which would have more people in the room. And I thought, there's no way. There's no way I can do that. But then something serendipitous happened. It was a T-shirt, actually. A few other events, but the T-shirt was the most significant one. The T-shirt said, "Feel the fear and do it anyway." And I was like, feel the fear and do it anyway. And that made sense to me. I knew that I would never be able to get rid of the fear. I don't know how to do that. And the more I tried, the worse it got. But maybe, just maybe, I could learn to behave in the presence of fear. And that's what I've learned how to do. And that's why when I tell people I'm afraid of public speaking, they never believe me because they can't see it. Because I'm not engaging in any of the avoidant behaviors that are typically associated with abject fear. But I am feeling the fear, and I'm doing it anyway. That's what I've gotten very, very good at, is just speaking while I'm terrified. It sort of goes back to what Franklin Delano Roosevelt said when he said, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. And when I look back, what I realized was I was really afraid of being afraid, because I didn't know what was going to happen while I was afraid. I didn't know if I was going to have a panic moment and run out of the room, or have an accident, or forget what I was going to say, just draw a blank entirely. Something horrible was probably going to happen if I was afraid. And it turns out just because somebody's afraid doesn't mean bad things are going to happen. So that's been my solution. And then there's a couple other dimensions to this. Another is, and this is what I tell my interns and postdocs, two things. One is, when you get up in front of a room, have your attention on your intention. And your intention is to communicate a particular message. This morning I did a keynote address, and I had an intention. And that was to have people feel good about the kind of work that they do. That was my intention. And everything I said flowed to that. And I kept my attention on that intention. Because if you don't have your attention on your primary intention, then another intention will surface and become the default intention. And that other intention is to look good and be right. And if you have that intention taking over your talk, and you're looking good and you're being absolutely right, well, then everybody goes home in a limousine. But if you get the sense that you're not looking so good, or your message isn't quite right, that sets the stage for a panicky response. But if your attention is focused on your primary intention, that doesn't happen. The second thing is, I try to interpret what I'm experiencing up here not as fear, but as excitement. So the bodily chemistry that a person generates when they're going to go on a roller coaster, and they like roller coasters, is the same bodily chemistry that I have right now. But the interpretation of that roller coaster is entirely different. They're excited about going on the roller coaster and terrified about getting up in front of an audience. But if you start to think of that whole bodily experience as actual excitement, then you've got fuel that you can use for your presentation. And I have I guess you'd call it energy of fear or energy of excitement, which is going to motor me through the next 3 hours. And maybe it'll help you too, because if you just have a speaker that's totally laid back in front of you going, yeah, it's pretty cool talking about stuff. What was I saying? I'm sorry, folks. Like that, then pretty soon you just snooze or go to your phone. But if you have somebody in front of you that actually is generating some energy, it's enough to keep you not reasonably interested. So, a little PR on anxiety. The laid-back people won the PR contest. We anxious people didn't even know there was a contest before we ended up losing it. So the laid-back people have made it seem that laid-back is a preferred state to be, and anxious is something to be avoided. Well, can you imagine what it's like to be married to a laid-back person? You're the one that has to make sure the garage door's closed, because, they don't care. You're the one that has to make sure that the food in the refrigerator isn't 4 weeks past its sell-by date. They don't even look. You're the one that has to make sure the credit card bills are paid. You're the one that has to make sure the flight arrangements for the family vacation are made in a timely fashion, and a hotel is reserved, because they'll get around to it, maybe. So the anxious person takes care of stuff. I try very, very desperately to hire anxious people. I don't have to worry about them. They worry about themselves. I don't have to check on them. They check on themselves. But, you get a laid-back person on your staff. You got to make sure that they get the paperwork in. You got to make sure they're greeting their clients on time. They're doing everything according to Hoyle. But with an anxious person, they're usually more or less on top of it. It's just somehow it got bad press. It isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can be a very good thing. When there's too much of it is when it becomes a bad thing. But that's true of all kinds of stuff, like Beer's not a bad thing, unless you have like 20 of them. So I'm making a case for anxiety being a fine characteristic, but we'll distinguish between anxiety and anxiety disorders. When you have an anxiety disorder, that's different. But just because you're anxious doesn't mean that you have an anxiety disorder. You don't have an anxiety disorder until your life becomes disordered. So being afraid to fly, that's not clinically significant. Being afraid to fly and not flying at all, that's clinically significant. Being afraid of getting up in front of an audience and giving a talk, now that's not clinically significant. But being so afraid of getting up in front of an audience and giving a talk that you would never, under any circumstances, do that for the rest of your life, that would be clinically significant. That's when your life starts to get disordered by the feelings that you have. So it's a universal experience. And it's also, in my opinion, that I make a lot of stuff up, and I'm going to make something up right now. I think it afflicts really intelligent people more than it does people that are a little slower on the uptake. Why? Because it often involves thinking about stuff in worst-case scenario terms, and the better you are at imagining and conjuring up scenarios, the more at risk you might be for being anxious. And so if you're really smart, that's one of the things you can do. You can think about stuff and envision a future that is perilous. So I don't know how many behavior analysts are out there, but behavior analysts are notoriously uninterested in the concept of anxiety. Now, why? It's not interesting to them at all? Not exactly that. There's certain features in the literature associated with anxiety that deters them from study, although the research is starting to pick up. I wrote a paper years ago with Steve Hayes and Kelly Wilson making the case that behavior analysts should study emotion, and we used the example of anxiety, and that's generated a little bit of response. So the first obstacle is the term itself. It's an imprecise term. Freud, who was the first person to really, I guess, popularize the term, he attempted to define it in a couple of his books. And I'm not kidding you, it is just gibberish. And he himself basically said the same thing. I mean, he's got a couple of paragraphs in there about what anxiety is, and at the end of it, he says, a certain vagueness in my attempt to define this term will not have escaped you. No, it was all gibberish. So he got nowhere. He's a pretty smart guy. Sidman said you couldn't define it. Levitt said you couldn't define it. McNaughton said you couldn't define it. David Barlow, arguably the leading anxiety researcher of the 20th century, also defined it in his book on anxiety. It's about 750 pages. He didn't attempt a definition for 100 pages. The definition that he came up with has 120 words in it. Many of the terms in the definition are themselves undefined, and so what we're dealing with here again is just gibberish. So, well, along comes one of my favorite guys, Pat Fryman. And so I took a stab at it. I don't think it was all that difficult to define. So here's my behavior analytic definition. A negatively reinforced behavior emitted in the presence of events that evoke or elicit the biology of stress or fear, but that pose minimal risk of harm. And you see B.F. Skinner is smiling. He loves that definition. But that's technical. Now I have a colloquial definition I came up with. Here it is. Fear is stuff that's unlikely to hurt you. Okay, so I don't know how many of you ever heard of Behavior Babe. If you haven't heard of her, I absolutely recommend that you go to her webpage and look it over and give her a like. She's really, really good for the field of behavior analysis. And she attended a talk I gave up in Kentucky about 3 months ago, on anxiety. And then she posted this slide on her webpage, and a couple of her followers went berserko because the guy, that's me, apparently trivialized this concept and doesn't really grasp what it's like to be an anxious person out there in the world struggling against unseen demons and perilous outcomes. And I don't know, I'm not trying to trivialize the concept. I'm just trying to simplify the concept. Trivial and simple are not synonyms. So I can see where if somebody really suffers from an anxiety condition and then they see just this, they might think I'm making fun of them. And I'm not, because this is about behavior analysts. I'm making fun of behavior analysts. Not anxious people. My heart goes out to anxious people. But my mind goes out to behavior analysts. And I want them to think things through more simply than they historically have. So if you don't like those definitions, then I'll tell you where I got the material. Right there. Yeah. And you can get your own material from the same place. All right, so it's also, this is tricky. It's not an is. It's an as if. The way we talk makes it seem like it's an is. It isn't an is. Well, it just sounds so funky to talk like that. But it isn't an is. It's an as if. It's a metaphor. It's not like anxiety was originally a term. It's a term from the Old English, the Old German, that was basically saying, it's as if I'm choking. It's as if I'm going to die. Now, the person wasn't choking, and they weren't going to die. But they're trying to communicate the experience that they're having. And so it was as if I was choking. It's as if I was going to die. But anguisse, which is the original term for anxiety, meant those things. It meant choking. It meant the experience of dying. But it's not that that's actually happening. It's kind of like that. But it sounds technical, anxiety. It really sounds like a clinical phenomenon. But there's also a term called butterflies. Like you're going to do a performance, and you're a little nervous, and you're maybe a little twitchy, and somebody asks, what's going on? You go, oh, man, I know it's like I got butterflies in my stomach. Not like there's butterflies in my stomach. It's as if there was butterflies in my stomach. But when you use the term butterfly, it's obviously a metaphor. Nobody thinks that butterflies actually exist in somebody's stomach, but everybody thinks anxiety actually exists in somebody's being. And they're the same kind of term. And behavior analysts saw through that and decided they're not going to study a metaphor. And this also leads to category errors. And it's another way of thinking. I'm sorry, I'm not going to spend our whole afternoon doing semantical analysis. I'm just going to spend a little more time and we'll move on to more meat. But people use the term in a way that's categorically erroneous. And we make category errors all the time. I know a lot of people that think they went to a university. I do. In fact, they believe, they truly, truly believe that they went to a university. But you can't go to a university. Nobody has ever gone to a university. It's not physically possible to go to a university because universities do not exist in the world. They only exist in language. You can go to the math building, no problem. You can go to the quad, you can go to the cafeteria, you can go to the stadium. Those all exist in the world. But the university itself is a category. To talk about it like it's something other than a category, like it exists in the world physically or materially, is to make a category error. And we all make those errors all the time. And behavior analysts spotted it. And they don't want to study a category. They want to study what's in the category, but they don't want to study the category itself. These are some of the reasons why they've been reluctant to pursue this as an area of investigation. So, what's in that category? Well, according to Skinner, there's only one thing in there. Because he did his study with Estes on anxiety back in 1940-something. And it was an elegantly simple preparation. Okay? He established a free operant baseline, and then he exposed the organism to some conditioned aversive stimuli, and the operant baseline was suppressed. And so he called that conditioned suppression, and then he said, that's anxiety. And no, it isn't anxiety. It is a member of the category called anxiety, and inside that category are a bunch of other things, most notably conditioned activation, because when a person is afraid, well, and their limbic system dominates their response pattern, then the limbic system just gives them a couple of options, but both of them involve activity, heightened activity. So for example, I'm afraid being in front of you. And my limbic system is giving me a couple of messages, a couple of options that I should exercise given how I feel about you. One is, I can attack and kill all of you. Or the other one is, just get the heck out of here so I'm not in danger anymore. Basically, my limbic system just wants me out of danger. And those are the only two options it gives me. And that's what actually happens with people when they use the wrong system to manage their events. So this experience I'm having here doesn't require emotional reasoning. It requires intellectual reasoning. But for some reason I get up here and my emotional system wants to get involved. But once it gets involved, it just gives me these stupid options. Attack and kill, run away. That's all you got? How did you get this far in life? So what you want is your intellectual system to manage this, and it will give me other options. So condition activation, condition suppression, but then there's all the mentality that goes with being afraid. Worst case scenarioizing, plane's going down, she's having an affair, I'm going to get flunked the test, there's no way I'm going to get my certification. Those kinds of thoughts. The physiological stuff I pointed out, heightened cortisol, epinephrine, heightened blood pressure, heightened heart rate, constricted pupils, pallor, sweating, dry mouth, that kind of thing. Just talking about it probably gets it going for some people. Me being one of them. And then motoric activity, the heightened activity. So those are all members in the category. They're all worthy of our study because they all occur actually in the physical world. Anxiety itself is a category and it can't be studied in the physical world. So here's some common occasions for anxiety. Not necessarily anxiety disorders, although these are pretty provocative occasions. One is the impossibility of escape. So every once in a while you read about somebody that's on an airplane, they're 36,000 feet, and they're trying to get out of the exit. And all that really involves is what you might call claustrophobia. They get this sense that they got to get out of the plane, it's impossible to get out of the plane, they can't really tolerate the feeling that they're having, and then they just lose it entirely, which means they lose contact with their intellectual system. Now they're governed by their emotional system, gives them two options, kill everybody on the plane or jump. Either way, they're escaping the feeling. Anticipation of punishment. Not punishment, anticipation of punishment. Now, I work with parents of adolescents a lot, and parents of adolescents frequently fall into the adolescent trap, which involves arguing with an adolescent, which is about as futile a thing as a human being can do. First and foremost, never in the history of our species has an adolescent in the middle of an argument with an adult gone, "Oh, yeah, you're right." Never going to happen. Meanwhile, if you're arguing with the guy or the gal, they're getting better at arguing. With who? With the person that's arguing with them. And typically the person that's arguing with them is an adult who's never going to get any better at arguing, but they're training the young person to get better at arguing with them. So what I recommend is instead do something that really bothers adolescents. Don't say anything and just look at them. Try to construct a physiognomy that's associated with constipation and then look at them. And they'll begin to anticipate the possibility of punishment, which is far more aversive than the punishment itself. I'll give you an example involving my own father. I love my father. He's deceased now, but I loved my father. But he was a hard guy. I mean, this is Montana. Land where men are men, and so are the women. I mean, it's a hard country. And so in the basement, there are two razor straps. One's a big, thick one, and one's a small, thin one. The big, thick one is for felonies, and the little thin one's for misdemeanors. And they're both for me, not for my siblings, just for me. Anyway, so I was about 12 when this happened. I went over to the bureau where he kept his change. I took some. I just took some. I was stealing from my father. And then, unfortunately for me, he walked over to the bureau to get some change because he wanted to go to the store and get something. He saw some change was missing, and he looked right at me. And he said, "Did you take the change out the bureau?" I said, "No, Mike did." Well, at least I saw him over there, my 11-year-old brother. And my dad just looked at me. That's all he did. And he got that look on his face. and he held it there just a little too long, and I knew he knew. And then he went and sat down. Okay, so that was, I don't know, more than 50 years ago. Here it sits. You see what I'm saying? Those two razor straps, I know he used them. I don't remember. They didn't really make an impact on me. But not doing something, leaving me with the fear that something was going to happen, I just don't know what or when, that's still sitting here. I'm waiting for him to walk in the door there and go, I knew you took that change. So the anticipation of punishment, and then separation from support. You know, that kind of that experience that kids between the ages of, say, 14 months and 18 months have separation anxiety. That can last all the way up through into adulthood. And when it does, usually it has clinical significance. Although, I don't know, am I the only one in this room that ever had his heart broken by somebody that they were in love with? Am I the only one? Sometimes you get it when that happens. You get that kind of separation anxiety when you've been broken up with by somebody that you really cared for. And that can last for a while. It can generate a certain kind of anxiety. Pavlov did some cool stuff that we don't much know about. You know, we know about the dogs and the bells and the meat powder and salivation, that kind of conditioning. But he used a bunch of other stimuli that you don't hear about. And here's a couple of them. He conditioned dogs to salivate to the presence of a circle the same way he conditioned dogs to salivate to the sound of a bell. He also showed them ellipses, but that was a neutral stimulus. Nothing happened there. So they discriminated between the ellipse, nothing, circle, salivate. And then he started to change the shape of the ellipse so it looked more and more and more like a circle. And there came a point where the dog could no longer make the discrimination, and at that moment they had panic attacks. They would cower and quiver, sometimes defecate and urinate, and then he couldn't recondition them after that. That's how powerful it was. I do presentations on dealing with difficult people. And a difficult person could be anybody for whom you have difficulty getting along with. And one of the things I recommend is to make it easy for people in your life to discriminate your reinforcers and punishers. And a big part of my work, my clinical work, is marriage counseling. And I promote the idea, and often it's the woman I'm working with, that she makes it easier for him to know what he's supposed to do. And frequently what I get is, he should just know. Or, if he loved me, I'm like, okay, so you're making it very hard for him to discriminate. And what that leads to, ultimately, is avoidance. Because he doesn't want to take the chance. And if you have to tell him, I realize it's not as exciting as if you did it kind of out of the blue, but you don't want him to ever have that kind of panicky response. I'm not telling him about Pavlov's dogs, but I'm kind of making the same point. You don't want him to ever have him have that experience where he just couldn't make the discrimination at all and he got all panicky and completely avoided and maybe even left the relationship. So, not being able to discriminate whether what's in front of us is reinforcing or punishing causes anxiety. You know anybody controlling? That's a sign of anxiety. It's not a sign of a power trip. I mean, there could be a power tripping could be part of the deal, but its primary function isn't power tripping, typically. Controlling people tend to be anxious, and what they find somewhere in life is that they can't control how they feel. So they try and control the stuff that makes them feel that way. Who likes to drive rather than ride? That's what that is. It's like you're in control of the car, not the bozo that's got lead foot. So you just feel, I mean, for an anxious person, you feel better if you can manage the car. It's one of the reasons why people are afraid to fly. They don't get to fly the plane. They have to ride in the back. And so that makes them nervous. But I would think if we let them go up front and fly the plane, then we'd really be nervous. So maybe they're better sitting in the back. Look for excessive avoidance. The key here is excessive. So I mentioned that earlier about public speaking, about riding on planes. It's excessive if you won't do either one ever. But just being a little afraid and a little avoidant, that's not necessarily clinically significant. Excessive catastrophizing, we can all come up with the worst case scenario, but continuously doing that and then suffering as a result of it, that's pointing us towards a clinical outcome. That need for control, unresponsive to reason. You can't reason somebody out of something they weren't reasoned into very effectively. If they got there in an emotional pathway, you're not going to get them off that pathway by using some kind of intellectual argument in a high frequency of events. Here's some select anxiety disorders. Specific phobia, you know what that one is. That's the mice and the snakes and the bugs and the spiders and little creepy crawly things. Then social phobia, that's a good one. Social phobia involves a phobic response to attention, not criticism, unless the criticism is critical attention. That's the tip-off. You know you're dealing with somebody that has a kind of a social phobic condition when any kind of attention is something that's aversive for them. Like you got, say, a little 11-year-old girl, and she's chosen to sing for the Christmas play, and all the parents are there, and all the students are there, and she sings Silver Bells, and she nails it, just nails it, every note. Not a dry eye in the house. And then she goes backstage after she gets a couple of curtain calls, and then her parents go back to congratulate her with a little bouquet of flowers, and she's sobbing uncontrollably and says she'll never do that again as long as she lives, and nobody understands why, because it was such a spectacular performance and so warmly received. So why this reaction? Well, the reaction is to the attention itself. It doesn't matter what the valence of the attention is, it just matters that it was there. And she's responding to that attention just the same way that somebody that's terrified of spiders would respond to spiders. What else we got? Agoraphobia, that's where life just shrinks down until it just becomes like a little postage stamp. The person doesn't even want to go out of their own house. They're like a shut-in. An obsessive compulsive disorder, what is that? Not quite right syndrome. That's what that is. It says the person is obsessed with the idea that the world isn't quite right. And they're terrified that if it isn't made right, that something terrible is going to happen. And so they're compelled to make it right. Obsessed with it not being right, compelled to make it right. And how is it not right? Honor. It isn't numbered properly. It isn't ordered properly. It hasn't been properly cleaned. It hasn't been properly arranged. It hasn't been properly checked. And there's a certain amount of that has to occur before they finally feel relieved from this terrible feeling that they have when the compulsion is satisfied, but it just builds on itself. I'll give you an example, a real clinical example of obsessive compulsive disorder a little later in this presentation. So, the downside of avoidance. And that's the key. Avoidance is the enemy, really. And not just with anxiety. You know, periodically with my clients, when we're talking about what they think of as psychopathology, I'm not a big psychopathology fan, by the way. I'm not a big DSM fan. I just think psychiatrists, psychologists, and all the mental health professionals that are in the diagnosing system, or the diagnosing enterprise, have really screwed this stuff up. Anyway, in the category of anxiety, there are these dimensions that aspects that I've mentioned. They have a clinical characteristic, and we identify what they are and come up with some kind of a plan to put them into the life of the person using exposure. We'll go over that. But these things, they're avoiding them. That's the problem. They're arranging their life so they don't have any access to this thing that actually makes them nervous or makes them upset or has them feel in some way afraid or nauseous. And it involves the concept of negative reinforcement, which is a challenging concept, a truly challenging concept. Because the average person doesn't grasp that negative reinforcement is as reinforcing as positive reinforcement. It's still good stuff. It just is relief, basically. So like on a really, really hot day, and you're just sweating and you just are really, really uncomfortable, and then you plunge into a nice, cool swimming pool, the instant you hit the water, you are experiencing relief from all that unpleasantness, and it's wonderful, and it's powerful. And so, in this avoidance, every successful behavior, or every behavior that successfully generates avoidance also generates negative reinforcement, so it gets stronger over time. The avoidant pattern gets stronger and stronger and stronger because it continuously makes contact with reinforcement. But it doesn't just stop there. The human being has this capacity called stimulus generalization, which means anything that's formally similar to the stuff they're avoiding is also part of the category. And what does that mean? There's 5 ways it can be similar. It smells like, tastes like, sounds like, feels like, and looks like the stuff in the category. That stuff, too, should be avoided and is avoided. It starts to generate more negative reinforcement. But it's even worse than that. Then there's derived relational responding. And I don't know how much derived relational responding presentation stuff is going to go on here over the next couple of days. Anybody know? Like, if there's going to be stimulus equivalence or relational frame theory, it's challenging stuff, and I definitely recommend attending those sessions. That is the new frontier in behavior analysis. The people doing that work have an answer for every criticism that was ever leveled at behavior analysis by people like Chomsky. We can answer all those questions very, very easily. So what derived relational responding involves is seeing similarity in the presence of manifest physical difference. It involves a relation that is more linguistic or language-oriented than physical. So how are an acorn and an Eskimo alike? Well, at first blush, you think they're not alike, but they actually are alike. They're both nouns. That's a relational similarity. They're both subject to the laws of gravity. That's a relational similarity. They're both in the conversation that we're having right now. That's a relational similarity. You can take any 2 phenomenon on Earth and show they're alike in many, many ways, and all those ways are relational similarities. So as a function of derived relational responding, everything that's in the category can ultimately be the same as everything outside the category, so that category can get huge. And that's where you get your agoraphobia. That's where you get your generalized anxiety disorder. That's where you get your PTSD, where it seems like the person is afraid of their own shadow. It doesn't mean they're a coward. It means they are the victim of an extraordinarily powerful conditioning program that has generated abject fear and a very narrow, narrow life, very small life. So, let me let you know a little secret. I don't work with persons on the spectrum. I never have. And I'm never going to, probably. I haven't done any research. I don't have. We do have some kids that you might think of as Asperger-ish that come to my clinic, but we don't really have the services for kids that are on the spectrum. So, what the heck am I doing here? You might ask yourself. I have another message, one that's more generic. I'm advocating for an idea, a way of thinking. And the way of thinking is pertinent to all human beings, not just a select group of human beings. Very pertinent to persons on the spectrum. If I were to start working with persons on the spectrum, I'm certain that I would be just as successful with them as I have been with the other folks with whom I work. And I know that with the spectrum, there's a broad range of avoidance that you have to deal with. Fabrics, smells, control, the temperature of the room, certain colors, lots of stuff that just kind of sets these kids off. But that's not our conversation today. We're not dealing with, I don't like it. We're dealing with, I am afraid of it. Those 2 things can look very similar, but one is way harder to work with than the other. And let me just see if I can explain that. So is it safe to say, how many people here are from Hawaii? Okay, because people in Hawaii like Spam. So is it safe to say you don't? Cold Spam. Anybody, any fans? Let's make it easy. You got cold Spam. Now I'm going to cover it with chocolate sauce. And on top of that, mustard. And on top of that, whipped cream. And on top of that, ketchup. Then sprinkles. Then pickles. Then some sugar. And then some Tabasco sauce. Would you be afraid of that? Would you avoid it? Yeah, because it's disgusting. That's different. Now, in Chicago, ABAI is going to be in Chicago next year. I think it's going to be at the Hyatt. The Hyatt is, I think, 25 stories high. At the top is the presidential suite, which if Maria's lucky, the incoming president will get that suite. And next to it is a helicopter pad. And when Janet Twyman was elected president, she had her party there and was in that hotel, in that suite. And some of us went out onto the helicopter pad. The helicopter pad is for the president, because sometimes when the president visits Chicago, he stays in the Hyatt, or she, if it happens to be that case, in the future. But they don't go to the check-in desk. You know, they go right up to the helicopter pad and then go into the room that way. That's why the helicopter pad is there. But when you have that suite, you can go out to the pad if you're brave enough to do that. So we did. So we're out there. It's pitch black out. We're 25 stories up. The wind is blowing. The tower kind of moves. And you can get right up to the edge. But you can't fall because there's some netting that goes all the way out. Very fine black netting. You can't see it, but it's there. It'll catch you if you fall. But there's something about whatever the mechanism is that has people be afraid of heights that gets activated when you get in front of something that's 25 stories down and the wind is blowing. So if you happen to be afraid of heights anyway, and somebody encourages you to go towards the edge, would you want to avoid that? More than you'd want to avoid the spam. It'd be an entirely different reaction, right? I mean, it'd be like we could come to blows here. We're not going to come to blows over cold spam, but somebody pushes me too close to the edge, I might have to get physical about it to communicate that that's not happening. That's what we're dealing with. That's the distinction. I'm looking at fear-based avoidance, not just straight-up avoidance. But in the ASD population, there's so much of both, sometimes you can't tell the difference. It isn't like I wouldn't know how to work with the other kind. Fact is, the same formula that's used for fear-based avoidance is the formula you used for just I don't like it avoidance. But that's such a big category, I want to stick with the fear-based avoidance. And the fear-based avoidance or anxiety is the one that people are most confused about. So, the threat-based stress response. Let me explain what that is. When a human being, a mammal actually, but I'll stick with human beings, is confronted with an aversive stimulus, it's interpreted by the emotional system as a threat. And that immediately activates the machinery of threat. And I talked a little bit about that earlier. What that means is the stress hormones are immediately released into the body. That's cortisol and epinephrine. When those are there, they recruit glucose from the liver and the muscles because the body's going to need fuel to deal with the threat. That glucose needs to be metabolized. That's the same thing as what happens to gas when it's in a car. That needs to be combusted there. So metabolizing is like combustion for the human body. And in order to metabolize that glucose, more oxygen is needed. And so a lot of oxygen is siphoned off in the system to metabolize that glucose. Have you ever either had this happen or seen this happen to a speaker? You've had it happen as a speaker or seen it happen to a speaker where it seems like they're going to run out of air before they get to the end of their sentence, like that? I will sometimes have that. Why does that happen? It happens because the person is afraid, and so they're going through everything I just said, and their body is using oxygen that was formerly available for speaking to metabolize the glucose. And so they need to breathe more deeply to get enough air in their system to finish their sentences, but they don't know that. And then they get even more afraid because they're afraid they won't get to the end of the sentence, because they're not going to get to the end of the sentence. Let's say they take a deep, and then it feeds on itself. But that's all that is. It just, under certain circumstances, you just have to take a deeper breath because the body's metabolizing the glucose that's in the body. Then once that happens, the engine is running. And if the action that the emotional system presents can be executed, everybody goes home in a limousine. Attack and kill or get away. Obviously, those aren't going to work. And so people distribute that energy in other ways. So let's say you've got a 15-year-old daughter, and for the first time, you've let her stay out on a school night past 10. And now it's 11. No call, and she's not home. And you can't reach her. And you can't leave the house. So you just have to wait. What do you do? Because all of that would have activated a threat-based stress response. And even if you're a laid-back person, you're not just going to sit in the easy chair and read a novel while you're waiting to hear what happened. Usually it'd be something like, oh God. Check the phone. Like that. That's just that energy. It needs to be distributed somehow. And you'll see that in the kids that you're working with. Once they get worked up, the energy's in their body. It isn't going to go anywhere until it gets distributed somehow, some kind of activity. And it takes a while for it to die down. Not forever, but it does take a while. That's one of the reasons why it makes sense when somebody says, if you're really mad, count to 10. Because that stress response, which is behind anger, will subside over time. You get to, with persons that are afflicted by like a panicky episode, or they're all of a sudden they're experiencing a threat, you get that kind of same kind of stimulus over-selectivity that you get with kids on the spectrum. They become overly focused. Their range of perceptual behaviors narrows, and they become stereotypic in their response. That's why, I don't know, think of the last time that you had an argument with your significant other, and either that person or you just kept saying the same thing over and over again in a louder tone of voice. Like they can't hear you. You're screaming at them and they can't hear you. Because it really becomes hard for the person to think of anything else in those moments because their brain has been hijacked by their emotional system. And so mostly it's just attack. And then later, when you can actually think, and you think back, well, why didn't I say that? Or why did I say that? Well, now more responses are available because you're no longer under threat. And this is what we're dealing with a threat-based stress response. There is a way to manage it. And this is something you can teach kids. This is something you can learn yourself. It's invented by the Navy SEALs. 4 by 4 by 4 by 4. Not a very elegant title, but it's very descriptive. So the Navy SEALs, when they are in battle, have to face genuine threats. And they have genuine threat-based stress responses. Same thing happens to them. Cortisol and epinephrine start to course through their body. And what does that do to them? Their hands shake. Anybody here shoot pistols? I'm not a pistol guy, but I know enough about pistols to know that if anything is shaking, it's going to throw your shot off. In fact, even your breathing comes into play. You've got to control your breathing as you're pulling a trigger, because just the exhaling of breath can interfere with the shot. As your hands are shaking, good luck on hitting something. So they need a way to calm themselves down because they're under fire. And so what they invented was breathe in for 4, hold for 4, breathe out for 4, and do that for 4 minutes. And that calms the system down. It almost cleanses the system of that cortisol and that epinephrine, and their hands start to calm down, and now they can aim their weapons. And that is something you could very easily, I would think, teach a kiddo on the spectrum. In fact, for those that know about the SEALs, you could put that in there, and it might even be more appealing to them. Be like the SEALs. Calm down. You know how to do it. 4 by 4 by 4 by 4. Go. Like that's something like that. Anxiety disorders are the most prevalent of all mental health disorders around the globe. 31% in the typically developing population and rising. But it's over 40% in the ASD population. Why would that be? Is it because it's part of the syndrome? Well, that would mean it has a biological basis. But there is no biological basis for anxiety. There's no biological marker for any of the conditions. So I don't know how they're ever going to show as part of the syndrome. There must be some other reason why it's so prevalent in that population. And I'm going to take a stab at explaining why from my own perspective using development as my argument. So there are a lot of developmental tasks that we all have accomplished very successfully, and that's why we're able to negotiate the social landscape of our lives so well. The first one of these is what's called secure attachment. And the attachment researchers, most notably Mary Ainsworth, but many, many others, showed this to be true. If an infant has a secure attachment to its caregiver, it will venture out further and stay longer in strange situations than if they don't. And by strange situations, I don't mean they're crawling over to the bad part of town. I just mean that they're getting out of the visual range of their caregiver. They'll go further out and they'll stay longer if they're securely attached. It's as if they're taking the security of the attachment with them into the world, and they feel like the world is secure, just like it's secure when they're near their caregiver. But if that infant doesn't have a secure attachment with his caregiver, they won't leave visual range. They want to stay as close to their caregiver as they can because they don't have that internalized operant sense of security in the world. They haven't established that yet. And the only time they feel secure is if they're with a source of security, which is their caregiver. So how secure would you say the attachment is of very young children that qualify for ASD? You know, they get a lot of insecure attachment early in life. And so already there's a developmental substrate that's missing as far as safety of the world itself. Then we've got interactive play. Now, you and I can engage in interactive play using objects called words. And it's it's the funnest thing that we can do, or one of the funnest things that we can do. We just throw words back and forth with each other, and we make each other laugh, we make each other curious, we make each other think, we make each other feel. It's just one of the great things human beings can do. And it's very interactive. But it rests upon a set of skills that we learned very, very early in life when we were using objects other than words, because we didn't know how to use words yet. We used toys. And in our interactive play, we exchanged those toys and made games out of those toys with each other, and doing that provided the substrate for ultimately being able to interact using words. But interactive play was the essential ingredient. How much interactive play is there on these young children that are on the spectrum? That's one of the things that people are most concerned about, is they don't interact very well with their peers, so they're missing that developmental milestone right there. That can add to their sense that the world is a strange and scary place, especially the social side of it. And now we're venturing into the domain of anxiety. And then learning interpersonal boundaries. Even walking down the aisle after these talks are over, we're still very careful with each other. You know, there's not very much room in that aisle. Sometimes there's 2 or 3 people that are standing somewhere in it, and as we negotiate to go through, we're very careful not to get our hands all over the body in front of us. And even we'll politely stand back while we're waiting for people to go by. We're honoring a boundary. But we didn't always honor a boundary. Visit a preschool. Visit a daycare. What do you think all that biting and bonking is about? It's like, you know, kids are pushing themselves up to stand, and they got their hand on the kid's face. The next thing you know, they got a bite mark on their hand because the kids say, "Get that hand out of my face." That's, you know, get out of my airspace. Stay away from my toys. Stay away from my body. And they learn that boundary stuff early, physically. But they don't learn it if they're over in a corner playing by themselves with 2 blocks. And so that boundary learning, which makes it safe for us to be in a crowded room together and negotiate narrow pathways like this one, doesn't have a substrate in their life. So this would possibly be a dangerous room for them to move in and move around in at the end of a talk. It's not truly dangerous. They just don't know about the boundaries. And they don't know the rules either. Like you and I do something it's so mundane, you don't even think about it. But then when you think about it, it is so profound, I can't believe that we do it. And no other mammal would ever do this, ever. No other mammal would enter into an enclosed space with other flesh-eating mammals that they don't know, and then let a door close on them and ride up and down vertically in a large building. We will do that regularly without even thinking about it because we know the rules. The rules are, enter the elevator, do not make eye contact, and for goodness sake, don't touch anybody, don't say anything. Swiftly turn around, press the button for your floor, then stare at the numbers over the door as if the secrets of the universe were contained there. And when you arrive at your floor, exit the elevator, don't look back. We know the rules. But somebody on the spectrum, do they know the rules? They might just enter the elevator and just not turn around, and then get nervous and touch somebody, or maybe start saying stuff that doesn't even make sense to anybody in the elevator. And all of a sudden, it's a really, really unpleasant elevator ride, and they miss their floor. And to me, that's potentially what life out there in the world is like for them. It's all confusing. It's all, or mostly aversive. It's safe at home. We don't have an elevator in the house. And I know everybody there, and they're all nice to me. And out here in the world, I don't know what happens. So inside of all human relationships is something that I refer to as a social interactional ratio. And there's a lot of research on this showing its role in marriages. It's a ratio between pleasant and unpleasant interactions. And the marital researchers have shown that inside of marriage, if that ratio stays about 5 to 1 on a regular basis, 5 pleasant interactions for every unpleasant interaction on a daily basis, that the marriage is immune to all the known causes of divorce, including infidelity. But if that ratio falls down to 1 to 1 or lower, divorce is almost a certainty. Well, there's lots of ways to divorce. It doesn't just happen in marriage. I explain this to parents of teenagers. If they can't keep that ratio up high, the kid's not going to talk to them or spend time with them. Why would they? There's no good stuff coming in. And these kids, these people on the spectrum, they've got a social interactional ratio with the world. And if that ratio starts to get dominated by the unpleasant interaction, they don't want to go out into the world. If it gets dominated by the pleasant interaction, they will want to go out in the world. They just fix the ratio and you can fix those relationships. Right there is the secret to all mental health care. I know before a person ever comes into my office what their problem is and how to solve it. I haven't met them before. I don't know what their file looks like. I don't know their name. But I know what their problem is. Their problem is a relationship problem. All human problems that involve people are relationship problems. Humans are relating organisms. And the relationship problems come in 3 categories. One is a relationship problem between the person and other persons or another person. The second category is a relationship problem between the person and an event or objects, like in PTSD or specific phobia. Or the relationship problem is a relationship between the person and him or herself, like depression or self-injurious behavior or low self-esteem. So that's the problem. I know they have a relationship problem, and I know how to fix it. Because I know that their problem is the ratio inside that relationship is dominated by the unpleasant, dominated by the punishment, dominated by the stick. And how do you fix it? Fix the ratio. Straight up, fix the ratio. Until it's dominated by the pleasant, dominated by reinforcement, dominated by the carrot. And what does that involve? Well, it involves getting more reinforcing, pleasant, or carrot-like substances in the life of the person. Well, where do we look for that stuff? You don't have to look very far and very wide, because all human beings treasure acceptance, approval, and appreciation under any and all circumstances. It's what everybody's looking for. It's what the fancy clothes are all about. It's what the titles are all about. It's what the status seeking is all about. It's what the speaker slots are all about. It's what the cool shoes are all about. Most of it, or just about all of it, is designed ultimately to get that stuff. And you can generate that stuff without burning a calorie. Sometimes you just don't want to give people that stuff. That's up to us, I guess. But if you don't give it to them and the ratio is affected by not giving it to them, then you end up with an unpleasant relationship with that person. And I don't know exactly how you get that into the life of a person on the spectrum. I don't work with persons on the spectrum. If I did, I'd figure out a way. But I'm leaving that problem for you guys to figure out. Anyway, so that's my speculation on why there's so much anxiety in the ASD population, because those developmental tasks haven't been mastered, and it leaves the social world such a strange and scary place for them. It's not really strange and scary to us, but it's strange and scary to them, but it's not truly dangerous, but they're afraid of it nonetheless. That makes it anxiety. So, signs of anxiety and social interactions, again, controlling stuff, bossiness, scripting, wanting to be in charge of everything, getting angry if kids are violating the rules, going off and playing by oneself, avoiding play altogether. It's kind of a natural trajectory. Here's signs of anxiety in the play of young ASD children. The tip-off in the play of young ASD children where it might be a sign of anxiety is it doesn't look like fun. They're not really having fun because it isn't about fun. It's about control. And there's a certain stereotypical nature to it where they're repetitively moving things around and the movements don't seem to make that sense. And what's ultimately happening is they've got this internalized upset and moving stuff around is dissipating that threat-based energy, and that's what's going on. Not always, but it's something to consider if you see a lot of that happening. They might be trying to control or manage or dissipate an internal feeling, which is associated with fear. Repeating. If somebody repeats what somebody says, that's no big deal. But if they repeat it over and over again with increasing intensity, pick up your room, 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 pick up your room. What's happening there is they're trying to get that energy out of their bodies. They're trying to not feel that way. The way they felt when you told them to pick up their room, presumably at a time when they were doing something else and they were thwarted in doing that, and they don't like to be thwarted. All of a sudden that bodily sensation emerges, and they don't like that either, and they don't know how to manage it. Same kind of thing with school-age kids, need for control, correcting the others, bargaining to get your own way, arguing if you don't get your own, taking over, or just avoiding it altogether, and then having emotional reactions over very little. And then in adolescence, adolescence anyway. Would you like to go back? And do it exactly the way you did it the first time. I don't mean go back and do it knowing what you know now. That would be so cool. We would kill. We would totally be on top of everything. I could date the cheerleader, you could date the quarterback. Because we know exactly how to get to these people, but we didn't know back then. And I would presume, maybe the president of the National Honor Society, the quarterback, maybe the head cheerleader, they had a great time in high school, but the rest of us really didn't have that good of a time. So it's bad enough as it is. And everybody is hyper concerned about where they fit in and what people think of them. Everybody's really socially anxious anyway. And then you throw a person with ASD into that crowd and try to get them to negotiate that landscape, and it's almost impossible for them. Because just the dynamics of day-to-day adolescent life in a high school when you are typically developing are challenging. Boy, if you don't pick up on social cues, even if you do pick up on social cues, it can be challenging. But if you don't, you're lost. Let's just say, as an example, Tom, Dick, and Harry and a kid on the spectrum are standing around, and Tom, Dick, and Harry are teasing each other. And teasing, that requires, a sense of timing, a sense of delivery, being able to, you hear the word, but you don't take it personally because it's said in a particular way that means it's not personal, but it's still an insult. But it's an insult that says, I love you, rather than I think you're an idiot. It's all so tricky. So Tom teases Harry, and they laugh, and Harry teases Tom, and they laugh, and Dick teases Harry, and they laugh, and then the ASD kid says the same thing that Tom said to Dick. And nobody laughs, and they all walk away. And he's like, well, you guys laughed, and they said that. What's going on? He goes home and tells his mother, they were all laughing, and I just said what they said. Well, there's just no way for the ASD kid to understand how important timing, delivery, prosody, nuance are to teasing. It's not just the words. And when the ASD kid says those words, it sounds like he meant it. It sounds like if I take you to Montana, I'll introduce you to my friends, and they'll be very gracious and polite with you, because they don't know you yet. That means they don't know if they like you or not. But when the insults start, you're in. You're totally in. Once they start coming after you, well, that means they really, really like you, and they figure you can take it. But determining that, knowing that, is kind of hard. You got to be sort of socially sophisticated to recognize that people that are teasing you are actually saying, we really like you, and we feel safe around you, safe enough to tease you. To get that nuance, I don't see how a person on the spectrum would ever get that nuance in adolescence, anyway. So it just makes life anxious for them. And then you got parent and caretaker anxiety. Jess, does it seem to you as if we are hyper concerned about children being upset now? Or am I one of those really old guys that are saying when I was a kid, we uphill both ways, 12 feet snowdrifts, whatever, 2 razor straps in the basement, whatever. Because it does seem, it seems like we are protecting young people from being upset in almost all of its forms. Our marketing department has asked me if I'd be willing to do a TED Talk. They want to make a pitch to TED for me to do a TED Talk, and they've got a topic picked for me. But just so you know, I am not doing this. I'm just telling you what their idea was. Here's their message. They want me to do this talk. Dare to be average. So I'm going to go out there in front of basically the whole world and make an argument for being average. No, that's not happening. That is not happening. I mean, I understand what they're trying to say, because everybody wants to be the quarterback, everybody wants to be the rock star, everybody wants to get the Nobel Prize, and we want kids to, realize they're not all going to get to the top of the heap. But I am not going to go out and give a talk on Dare to be Average, because that'll play right into the hands of the people that think like I do, that we're protecting kids now from trying to excel, or trying to effort at stuff, trying to work towards stuff. Instead, let's just, what the heck, I'll just take a C. Just give me a C, that's all I need. No, I'm not going to make that argument. And I think that's for typically developing kids. But boy, you got a kid that's got a chronic illness, or they got a condition like ASD, we really want to protect them. But do they need that protection, or do they need the protection that we're providing? What does that do for them? How do they learn to protect themselves? And how do they learn the ability to stand up to the sticks and the, we said that this morning, sticks and stones will break my bones, and nails never hurt me. Well, obviously that's not true, but we can make it true by learning that when somebody calls us a name, it can't touch us physically, it just touches us psychologically, and that requires our input. And if we take our input out of it, our interpretation of what they just said out of it, then there's no upset. How do kids learn that if they aren't exposed to it in the first place? In Navy SEALs, when they're trying to train people to see if they're going to make it as a Navy SEAL, and they go down in the field, they walk over to them and they say, "Are you injured or are you hurt?" And if the guy says, "I'm injured," well, they cart him off to the hospital and take care of him. They don't want to damage the guy. But if the guy says, "I'm hurt," they do everything they can to get him to quit, right on the spot. Everything. They offer him food and a place to sleep. They'll get a female cadet to come over and take care of him, because they don't want anybody in the SEALs that'll quit just because they're hurt. They want people that will learn to play hurt. Not play injured, just play when they're hurting. And I'm older than just about everybody in this room. Considerably older. And I got to tell you, it isn't a pain-free trip. As you get older and older, it isn't a pain-free. You have to learn to have pain and still carry on in your life. And I'm not talking about some chronic condition that afflicts me. I will never have a pain-free day for the rest of my life. And it's largely a function of being physically active and taking care of my body and doing all the stuff I'm supposed to do, and having one that's this old. And so this helicoptering that we do with kids, I'm not sure it's really good for them. It might be good for us. It makes people feel good. Okay, they're safe. But it's not necessarily good for their development, in my opinion. Some of it's good, but too much of it is not good for them. Cocooning them and helping them when they haven't asked for help. My wife likes to help. She likes to help. She can't help herself. She can't help herself from helping. So we've got this complicated entertainment center with all these controls. I got like 5 remotes. And sometimes I get a little confused. And so I'm trying to figure out, how to get the streaming station on. And the last thing I want to do is make a sound or frown in any way. If I do that, it's a signal for assistance. And I'm trying to think it through. I'm trying to figure it out. And then when she sees that little furrowed brow that I get, she starts helping me, and I get distracted from what I was thinking about, because I'm responding to what she said, and I lost my place over here. I'm like, I don't want to go, honey, don't help me. But I do want to do that. I don't want to start an argument over a streaming channel. So I fake like I got this totally handled. Yes. I fake laid back. I got this. I'm advocating for dealing with these kids like you were a mother of 12. You know what I mean? Like mother of 1, kids get the sniffles, off to the ER we go. It could be bronchitis. Mother of 12, kid breaks his arm. She checks. That's not a compound fracture. Said it yourself. Mother of 12 has seen everything. She knows when to hold them. She knows when to fold them. She knows when the cry is really pain or when it's just hurt or upset. She knows exactly how to allocate her social and emotional resources so all the kids get exactly what they need, but nobody gets a surplus, which is basically the argument I'm trying to make here. I used to do these developmental assessments, the Bailey scales of infant development. And I wanted to learn how to do this really, really well, so I went all through the University of Kansas Health Center, and I went into every office where there were women, and asked if they had kids. If they had young kids, I asked if I could do an assessment of their kids. So I did like a couple hundred of these. And you can do them down to 4 weeks. You can start assessing intelligence, in 4 weeks. And there's, I'll give you an example. With these really young kids, I have to have them sit on mom's lap because they can't sit in there unattended. So I got mom in there too. So I'm testing the kid, but I got to be careful about mom. So here's the test. You show the kid a block, and then you set it down. And the kid looks at it. He's thinking about that. And he realizes, I have a block grabber right here. So he activates the block grabber and gets the block, and that's a pass. So I put down another block. And now they're puzzling through this because they've got a preferred block grabber. It's occupied. And they haven't really used this to grab blocks before, but there it sits. And they're like, well, I have another block grabber. And they get the block. Now they got 2 blocks. Then I put down a 3rd block. This is where mom gets involved. Because the kid, they'll cry a little because they want that block. They're looking at it. They got nothing to work with. And then they set down one block, pick up the other one. Oh my God, right back where I started from. It's a little painful to watch, but it's fun to watch. But then mom gets involved. But I'm not testing mom. I know she can pick up 3 blocks. I'm absolutely certain that she can. But she gets so uncomfortable with her child's discomfort that she's got to get in there and help out. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. It isn't always necessary. Unintended danger or anxiety signals. Questioning. How is it today, honey? How are you? You okay? Well, okay, that's a question, but inside of the question is an assumption that there's a possibility that they're not okay. Why put that out there? Or maybe just put it out like this. Is it possible you're not okay? I mean, I can understand you want to know. I understand we have a limited range of things we can actually ask somebody when we're concerned. And of course we want to know, and then we're looking for the high sign from them and everything's fine. But that's not a neutral exchange. It may be a caring exchange, but it isn't necessarily a beneficial exchange. Or, checking, just checking. Why are you checking? Well, because there might be trouble. So that assumes that there could be trouble. 5 minutes? I'll let you have a break in like 5 minutes. Yeah, okay. Overprotection, same thing. Reduced independence. They got to learn this stuff somehow, and they can't learn it unless they have the actual experience. Enabling avoidance. Obviously, it's easier if we let them avoid all the stuff they don't want to do. It's easier for everybody, but it isn't good for everybody necessarily. And then attention to fear. Attending to fear and overlooking little instances of bravery. So the social attention is being shifted over to what we don't want to see. And again, what we know about the ontogenesis and the basics of behavior is there's no neutral. There isn't any neutral. Behavior is being exposed to various circumstances. Some promote its development and some promote the opposite. And they're always occurring. So we want the kind of events that are occurring in the life of the child to go in the direction that we want the behavior to go. And frequently out of caring responses, it goes the other way. Let's see, maybe. Let me just do this dilemmas one, and then I'll let you have a break. So what do you do? There are truly dilemmas here. Encourage participation, that could go bad. Encourage exposure and bravery, or allow avoidance or withdrawal. How much noise? How much noise? You ever go into a house and the woman answers the door and goes, baby's sleeping. And you know that kid's screwed. You know, there's not a hotel in the country where they're going to get that kind of silence. So if they travel at all, they're going to have sleepless nights. And I don't know what my grandmother did with my dad, but whatever it was right. Because my father was an air traffic controller, and he had that 11 to 7 shift. And so when he came home, he'd lay down in the living room and sleep on the couch. And my mother would be in there vacuuming all around the couch. And he sleeps right through it. And so I would love to have that ability. Should they have animals? Well, you know, maybe not a Great Dane, but you could start with a goldfish. You start with something, some other live being in the house, and work your way up the phylogenetic scale. You know, foods, they got like narrowed food preferences, but they can't just eat chicken McNuggets, cheese strings, and chocolate milk for the rest of their life. You're going to have to throw a vegetable in there somewhere. We want to expand out those food preferences. Play dates, you know, those could go bad. In fact, they're going to go bad. But if they never have them, how are they supposed to learn to get out and play with other people? And competing, should they be allowed to compete? Because you know how they are when they lose. How are they supposed to learn to lose if they don't lose? Well, we can prevent competition from happening, but not forever, unless the parents are vampires and they're going to live forever. You know, outings could go bad, but they need some kind of experience with outings. They could be short outings. Like back when I used to work with little kids, and one of the problems we worked on was misbehaving in the grocery store. Have you ever heard of this? So I'd work with the families that were on my caseload. We'd go to the grocery store with the little one, get one item, go through that short line, and get out. And then, like, a ticker tape parade for the kid. So we got a little tiny outing, and they benefited from being cool while we were doing it. And then worked our way up to the, overheaping shopping cart full of stuff. Like, you could do an outing like that, just a short little outing. Perfectionism? I don't know. You're not going to get very far in your doctoral degree seeking, your master's degree seeking, without a certain amount of perfectionism. Perfectionism isn't necessarily a bad thing. And if you aspire to be an editor one day, you can go overboard with perfectionism, but you can also go the other way and do really sloppy work. So, I've got compulsions here. I might want to talk about that at another point in this discussion. Very important. I want to make sure I don't miss it. Can I count on somebody to remind me I want to talk about compulsions? Okay. Okay, well, how about taking a 15-minute break, and I'll be back here. I went back to a slide that I had up earlier because there's a message I didn't communicate about distress tolerance. The low distress tolerance I'm referring to there isn't the distress tolerance of the person with ASD. It's tolerance of their distress by us. Ours is low. And so what I'm seeking there is for us to heighten our own tolerance for their distress. I don't know how you feel about timeout. I think that when done well, it's a pretty powerful procedure. It rarely is done well. And mostly what I hear is, well, we tried timeout, that didn't work, which is a failure to understand that learning is a function of repetition with contrast. And if there's low contrast, then you need a lot of repetition. And just because you do timeout once or twice doesn't mean that you really begin in a test. But anyway, what timeout requires, if you're going to do it well, is distress tolerance. Because it's timeout from positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. And if the distress of the child in timeout activates anything on the part of the caregiver, even a frown, then you're signaling something like the possibility of escape, which is a potential negative reinforcer. So distress tolerance is actually a very big part of our work. And people that have low distress tolerance should probably find another job. Because we all are by definition working with a distressed population. And if you have low tolerance for distress, why would you pick that population to work with? Anyway, I forgot that message. And let's go to dilemmas for professionals. Same thing as the dilemmas for parents, except, I don't know, some of it involves, there were a lot of teachers in the keynote address audience this morning, and so there's a lot of classroom expertise here. And so the teachers have dilemmas. What do you do with the kid at recess? You just let them go out there and where the law of the jungle presides over the playground? Or, and if you hang at their side, you're sending the wrong signal to the bullies in class. So I can see a dilemma there. Exactly how much freedom do they have to go out and hang at recess? And then the most dangerous times in the life of a kid that has any kind of a stigmatizing condition in high school is the hallway during classes, the assemblies, and anything that's outside. Because that's where the teachers have the least amount of supervisory possibilities, and that's where the most can go wrong. Some in the bathrooms, I guess, are also sometimes dangerous. But in the hallways, it's socially and physically dangerous. Well, I don't have an answer for this question. These are just places where you're always going to be at a choice point. How much supervision, how much monitoring do you do? How much leeway do you give the kid? And that's, as much as you possibly can and not put the kid at risk. So I guess, again, it requires a substantial amount of your own distress tolerance because the kid is likely to be distressed. But then are they distressed emotionally, psychologically, physically? If it's just psychological distress, maybe they should be left to handle it on their own. Maybe not. Depends on the intensity of the distress. Should the kids go on field trips? Well, yeah, they should. But it's possible that bus might have to turn back around, drop somebody off. But I think it's a risk worth taking. But then again, does it ruin it for all the other kids? And then does the kid become a target for the other kids because their field trip got ruined? I mean, again, I'm just addressing potential dilemmas here. I'm not answering any of them. These are things that just need to be considered and problem solved. So here's some strategies for parents and caregivers. One is praise and attend to brave behavior, ignore more non-brave behavior. Catch them being good, I guess. What are we talking about? We're talking about brave behavior, like rushing into a burning building and saving a baby. No, you got to watch for these moments. There'll be instances that are very subtle where the kid does something a little more than they ordinarily do. They put their neck out just a tiny bit further. And that needs to get watered and fertilized way, way more than the opposite gets attention. Like, you want the good stuff to get more attention and better attention than the bad stuff gets. Unfortunately, as mammals, we are wired the other way. The way that evolution developed our brains and all our response patterns is to pay way more attention to sources of trouble and danger than to the opposites of those things. The brain kind of calms down around the good stuff and then really goes a little haywire over the potential risky stuff. And so the potentially risky stuff in others gets more attention than it actually should, and the stuff we prefer gets less attention than it should. So how much routine appropriate behavior gets attention? I guess I would advocate here for that ratio. If you keep that ratio in mind, like the interactional pattern between you and the kid of concern, you and your spouse, you and your siblings, you and your children, if you want those relationships to just hum, if you keep those ratios around 5-to-1, pleasant over unpleasant, they'll shift their negative attention to somebody else. People will protect their sources of reinforcement. The secret of my professional success, of which I've had an abundance, has been learning how to work with my bosses. I always try to identify my boss's reinforcers, and then I try to deliver them richly. I have never asked for a raise. I have never asked for a promotion. And Boys Town built me a 36,000 square foot building, brand new. And I didn't ask for it. My opinion is that you don't necessarily need to either dominate or manipulate or challenge supervisors. That's one way of getting stuff, but they usually do it begrudgingly if you do it that way. Another way is just to become so absolutely necessary to them that they'll do anything they can to take care of you. And one way to be necessary is to deliver reinforcers for people. You first have to identify what they are. And that's kind of what I'm referring to here, is we want the kids to be rich sources of reinforcement for appropriate behavior. We know that because of their response patterns, they're going to get an abundance of attention for the wrong kinds of behavior, because a bunch of the behaviors that they have activate that kind of response. And thus they get reinforced that way and grow in strength. We can curtail that somewhat, but we can't eliminate it. But we can certainly emphasize the other ways, like catch them being good and deliver, or catch them being brave, or catch them trying, catch them efforting, catch them going the extra mile, and then richly deliver when you see that. Model brave behavior and use role reversal. So the wrong way to go with a kid that's afraid of doing something is to tell them that it's no big deal, and then show them that it's no big deal. Because then they figure, well, it's no big deal for you. And then they just feel even more abnormal because they know it's a big deal for them. Just because I can show a kid this was no big deal, that doesn't mean they're going to say, oh, I see, it's no big deal. Because it already is a big deal for them, or we wouldn't be having the conversation. And I'm not going to be able to talk somebody out of something they weren't talked into. They experience their way in, they're going to have to experience their way out. My logical explanations for things aren't going to carry a lot of weight. Sometimes they do, but not often. So a better way to go is to let the kid know that it's challenging and then do it, but having them know that it's hard. So an example might be, let's say I'm a mom and I'm talking to my son because some neighbors moved in next door, they're new, and I tell them that, you know, honey, I really have to go over there and meet the new neighbors, but boy, I'm just not comfortable around strangers, and this just really makes me uncomfortable. But it's just a neighborly thing to do. So I've made them some cookies, and I'm going to go over. But I'm so nervous, I don't know if I have anything to talk about. Can you give me any advice about going over there? You know, of course, the risk is, yeah, Mom, don't go. Okay, well, I thought of that already, honey. I already thought of not going, but I really have to go. They're our neighbors. This is just what neighbors do, and so I am going to go. Do you have any other advice? Like that. So you actually get into that kid's world view. Right? This is hard. I'm doing it, though. It's hard, and I'm doing it. Not, it's really easy. It could be easy for you. Not that route. I wouldn't recommend that route. Let them see that. Let them see you sweat. And then allocate responsibility, encourage independence, allow mistakes. Obviously, things are not going to go well. Is that so bad? You know, you allocate responsibility and they screw it up. You know, like, let them water the plants. Okay, so what's the worst case scenario? Well, death to the plant. But again, we're just talking about plants here. We're not talking about the family dog. We can work our way up to the family dog. But really, I think it requires us to assess, well, how awful would it be if they screwed this up? I mean, if it would be awful, if it would interfere with family finances and ruin our relationship with all the neighbors and bring police, well, maybe we shouldn't go that far. But rarely do the things we're concerned about lead to those kinds of dire consequences. Usually it's just really bothersome that it might happen. And I don't know, again, it gets back to distress tolerance. You know, let's heighten the extent to which we're willing to be bothered on behalf of those that we love but are trying to figure out a way to work with. And mistakes, you know, we've got to, man, human beings invented a whole bunch of stuff early on before you and I got involved and before they ever asked us for our opinion. And one of the things that I think we are really bad about interpreting are mistakes. You know, so people are so afraid of making mistakes, so afraid of being wrong. And what's the big deal? Charlie Catania, he's given a talk next door. He did some he's done so many cool studies. Charlie Catania. If you don't know who he is, you've got to find out who he is. because he's a legend, really, in our field. He was one of Skinner's students way back in the day. He's still contributing. Well, here's one of his studies involved showing how big the operant class was with pigeons. So pigeons were to peck a disc to get grain, and then they kept track of where all the pecks were. And in order to get the grain, the peck had to be in the middle of a disc, but not all the pecks were in the middle of the disc. Some were outside the disc. This is his contribution. Those are still part of the operant class. They're still controlled by the contingency. They're called mistakes. But mistakes are necessary for successes. They go together. And if you talk to great businessmen whose self-image as a businessman or woman whose self-image as a businesswoman is totally secure, they're totally secure, they're going to tell you failure was absolutely essential to their success. Absent their failures, they never would have gotten where they are now. We got this notion, it starts early when you're teaching kids how to walk. You know, I think parents think they can teach a kid to walk. No way. Not enough distress tolerance. I'll show you what teaches a kid to walk. That's what teaches a kid to walk. Because Mother Earth doesn't really care. Mother Earth has a lot of distress tolerance. She could take all the distress we got and then it had way more. And so every time the kid falls, they're distressed by falling, and that is what teaches them to stay upright. That, come on, come on, come on, come on, that stuff motivates them, doesn't teach them all that much. And then our praise for getting to the other side of the room, that's good, that's reinforcing, but the real reinforcer there is not wanting to fall. And if they hadn't fallen, you know, if we would have taught them to walk on a mattress-laden room, it'd really screw them up when they get out on the hard asphalt streets of everyday life. We want them to make those mistakes. Emotional coaching. What does that mean? Go to YouTube, type in Carl Rogers, watch him do a session, and then you'll see what it is. He delivers a commodity that is so scarce in this world after infancy that it's almost non-existent. And he gave it a term. Unconditional positive regard. Unconditional positive regard. No matter what the client said or said they did, Rogers was just very accepting of it. And he called that psychological medicine. And it is. It's active psychological medicine. It is a balm. It is like an emotional nutrient. And we just don't get very much of it after infancy. And I'm recommending it for these kids. Like, there's so many things we're working on and so many things we're directing them to do and cocooning their world. And maybe just every once in a while a dose of, you're fine, you're wonderful, just you. You and your stereotypical responding and the way that you spit when you eat and the fact that you're not toilet trained and maybe never will be is just still love to me. Whatever. Set reachable goals and use proportional rewards. In other words, you know, let them win. Like when I discovered backward chaining, I thought I discovered the secret of the universe. I was at that Boulder River School and Hospital I talked about this morning, and my instruction was to teach Gary to make his bed. And I don't know, I just thought to myself, where do you start? And then somebody that knew about backward chaining came in and said, oh, well, here's where you start. You start at the end. And then you work backwards. And I don't know, maybe I'm not smart enough to think of stuff like that, but I thought that was ingenious. And so we make the bed, and we pull back the cover off the pillow, and then we go to Gary. Gary, make your bed. Flops the cover over. We erupt into, applause. And then gradually worked our way backwards until all the bedding was on the floor. And it took him longer, but he would make his bed just like he'd been taught to do it in the military. And that's just like building wins into the program. So we can do that, you know. We can divide up the steps in programs so they're so small that they're easily successfully passed. Create opportunities for change. I stretched the truth a little bit when I said I don't work with persons on the spectrum. I have had and do have a couple of folks that work with me that are spectrum-ish. You probably would call them Asperger-ish. And a couple of them are astonishingly successful businessmen. But I got a big office, and I have like 8 pieces of furniture in there, and before they come, I'll just move them around a little bit. You know, they come in and they're like, it's not the way it was before. Somebody must have messed with the office. Let's just make do. Schedule worry time. You know, and like when I work with anxious kids, I actually tell them, you know, pick 10 minutes a day and get into it. Wail and gnash your teeth. You know, think of how horrible it's going to be. Bring everything to mind. Boogeyman and infectious diseases and car wrecks and your parents' funerals and the death of your pet, whatever you're worried about. Getting all F's on your report card, or if some kids getting all A's on your report card. Having somebody say that your brother is actually handsomer and a bit more athletic than you. Whatever your fears are, just get into them. Do it on purpose. Set a timer. And then when the timer rings, you're done for the day. And what does that do? Well, it's like insulating them from all the stuff that they're trying not to think about and not to say, and thus, as a result, like taking the power away. Or if you happen to know anything about acceptance and commitment therapy, it's diffusion. So, in acceptance and commitment therapy, Steve Hayes, when he does the treatment, will have a person sit across from him, and they'll pick a word that is kind of central to whatever the person's problem is. You know, let's say impotence. So that's a big deal for them. And so the two of them will just say over and over again, impotence, 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 like that, until it comes to the point where it no longer means anything. It's just a sound. The meaning has been drained out of the word, and now it's just an assembly of letters, and it no longer has that stimulus impact. That's what scheduling worry time can do. It's like take the power out of it by actually overdoing it rather than not doing it at all. And incorporate intense or unusual interest. This is back to compulsions. I found my spot. So, you got these young people, maybe old people, that have ritualistic behaviors, stereotypical behaviors, self-stimulatory behaviors, and if they, in some way, shape, or form, cause stimulus or tissue damage, we should work on them. But if they don't, do we have to get rid of them? And if your answer is yes, why? Well, it's not hurting anybody. Now, what I do with them instead is privatize them. I had a conversation with someone, I forget where you are, about thumb sucking at the break. Because I have a distinction in my professional career, which I'm rather proud of. I've published more papers on thumb sucking than anybody that ever lived. And nobody gives a damn. Nobody cares. I just thought it was interesting, and it was fun to work with, and it was easy to work with. And what I finally concluded is, what's the big deal? If they're not hurting themselves, why take that from them? You know, now you can hurt yourself in thumb sucking. You can hurt your teeth, but you have to do it a lot. And you can hurt your thumb, or you can hurt your finger. You can get accidental poisoning if you live in a house with lead-based paint. Or you can hurt your social relations if you happen to be in the first grade or above. But if you just do it privately and you don't spend your whole life in a private room, it's completely harmless. So that's what I try to do with thumb sucking, is just privatize it. And that's what I recommend about this intense interest, this compulsive behavior. Privatize it and make it contingent. Now, where did I get this idea? I went over to my boss's house to watch a Notre Dame game. So we're in the living room watching the game, and there's this noise coming from the room next door. Like that. And I'm, what is that? He goes, oh, it's Luke. He's in there doing his thing. And his son Luke is Asperger-ish. He's got a job in Boys Town. It's a decent job. His IQ is probably in the 120 range. But he's socially a little awkward. and he still lives at home. And when he gets all his chores done, then he gets to go into a room and watch TV and do his thing. And I said, well, what's his thing? She goes, go in there. And so I go in there, and Luke is like watching the game. Hey, Luke, how you doing? Yeah, good, yeah, like that. And I thought, I never would have thought of that. You know, it's weird to look at, but I don't have to look at it. He does it privately. It's his thing. And let me say this about you, and I'll say it about me too. We have things. I don't want to know about yours. And there's no way you're going to find out about mine. But we all have things, and we've just privatized them, and thank the Lord for that. So I'm alwa's looking for sources of reinforcement. And if you've got somebody that loves doing something and it's harmless, then you've got a potential reinforcer. That's the Premack principle. High frequency behaviors can be used to reinforce low frequency behaviors. So we might want to use that behavior rather than get rid of it. And then exposure, extinction, and desensitization. I'm going to go through those. So strategies for professionals. First, there's medication. Bear in mind, there isn't a medication out there that will cure anxiety. What it'll do is mask the symptoms of anxiety and stabilize the person. And sometimes that's necessary. I have to coach my staff on this. I mean, they know I'm a behavior analyst, and sometimes they will voice opinions that they think behavior analysts all have. And so they object to clients that might want to try medication. I have to calm them down about that because sometimes medication is our friend. Particularly if somebody is so anxious they just can't even function in everyday life. We want to get them stabilized so that they can start to participate in treatment. I mean, I'll just give you a quick example. I have a client, most of my clients are adults, by the way, and actually very, very well-to-do people that live in Omaha. This young mother was suffering from what probably was postpartum depression and anxiety. And she had 2 children. One was a year and a half, and one was a newborn. And she would just go on and on about how horrible it was just to be with them when she was in my office. I have another client, and he's an OBGYN, and he's working with me on anger issues. And I didn't know where to go with a woman with the postpartum depression. I wanted her to take medication. She absolutely refused. Absolutely refused. Said she's tried it once in her life, made her feel like a zombie, blah, blah, blah. I didn't want to do it ever again. And so I talked to the obstetrician, and I asked him if he would be willing to take a look at my client because he'd probably faced a lot of postpartum depression in his career. And he saw her once and got her on medication. And I was like stunned by that. How'd you do that? And he goes, well, you know, you take a woman, and she loves chocolate chip cookies, and she hates pickles. Then she gets pregnant, and now she hates chocolate chip cookies and loves pickles. Now, that's hormones. But then, when she breastfeeds, she has no hormones whatsoever. And when you have no hormones in your body, you can take a little tiny bit of an antidepressant and get a major effect. And he said, so that's how I convinced her. She could take a very small dose of Zoloft, and it would have a big impact because she doesn't have any hormones because she's breastfeeding, and she'd get that effect, and she wouldn't have that zombie-like feeling. I'm like, wow, that's ingenious. But more to the point, 2 weeks later, she comes in, and she can't stop talking about these 2 kids. How adorable Everett is, and he's using words, and he's walking really, really well. He loves his little brother, and Elon is starting to sleep through the night, and I love holding him. He's like a different person. I was like, did a vampire bite you in the neck? Because I don't even recognize you. So she's stabilized. She doesn't want to take this medication forever, but this medication is going to get her through this rough patch. And it was a pretty serious rough patch. And you know how far that postpartum depression can actually go if you want to worst case scenarioize that. And then behavioral treatment. So there's the primary types of medication, not opposed to those. Behavioral treatment, health education, externalization, relaxation, irrational thinking, targeting it, escape, extinction, and incentives. So health education. That's all I've been doing for a couple hours, basically. Is we just want to inform people about what we're dealing with because our culture has everybody weirded about anxiety. And like I said, the laid-back people won the PR contest, so anxiety appears to be people's enemy when it really could be their friend. And I have kids name it. I actually have everybody name it if I can get them to do that. Like, it gives people a little distance. Like if we were doing a real workshop all day, I'd have you do this. I'd have you close your eyes and then envision yourself in your chair. You know what I'm saying? So you see yourself sitting there. Then I ask, well, which one's you? The one sitting there or the one looking at the one sitting there? You see that? You see what I'm saying? There's a little distance there. And if you start creating psychological distance, you diminish the extent to which people identify with the feelings that they're having. Or they're having them, they aren't being them. And so what I want these kids to do is name their anxiety, so when they come in, I'm not talking about them, I'm talking about their anxiety. And, you know, when the Lord of the Rings was popular, everybody, all my kids were like Gollum. Gollum this, Gollum, how's Gollum? Oh, he's in a box. I am just getting the best of Gollum, whatever. It's so cool to talk about it like that way. And with my adult clients, I won't use names, but I'll use it. You know, if we're working on their anger, or working on their depression, whatever. It's not their depression, it's not their anger, it's it. Who's winning? You or it? Oh, it's really had its way with me. Like that. Just creating a little distance, kind of calming people down about it, not having them subsumed by it. I teach them relaxation, a 4x4x4 method we talked about already. Also, focused breathing. By the way, there's nothing magical about meditation. Meditation is just focusing your attention on something simple and keeping it there. And guess what? As soon as you do that, it wanders. Then you bring it back. Guess what? Then it wanders again. Because there are so many really important things to think about all of a sudden. I'm not kidding you. They just come to mind one after the other. Like, think about this, think about that. Have you thought about this lately? This is really important. Oh, by the way, like that. Meanwhile, you're trying to stare at a candle. And your mind is having nothing to do with that candle. There's nothing less interesting right now than that candle. That's meditation. People say I'm not good at it. Nobody is. The guy in the cave that's been doing it for 25 years is having the same trouble. It's exercise for the brain. You bring your attention back. It's like a curl. You know what I'm saying? You're in the gym, you curl. You bring the attention back, it's a curl. It's your strengthening a part of the brain. So focused breathing is meditation. Focus on your breathing. Meditative practices, like instead of having our mind wander all over the place as we're going to the car, we can just be conscious of our walking to the car. That's meditation. Any kind of mindfulness. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on targeting irrational thinking. I don't get very far with this unless I have a very, very verbal client who's kind of talked themselves into their situation. I try and talk them out of it. But all these irrational ways to think, all or nothing, it's all rule-governed behavior, really. It's all rule-governed behavior. And Charlie's over there right now talking about rule-governed behavior. He's an expert in it. Incentives. I don't know, we're asking these, I'll show you this. We're going to be asking people to do hard stuff. They should get something out of it, rather than just pleasing us. And, I've invented a lot of ways to incentivize little kids. One is a grab bag. You probably know this stuff. We just get a grab bag full of slips of paper, write down little deliverables, edibles, and some money on pieces of paper. The kid pulls a slip out, they get that. We put one in there for the largest amount of money they can imagine and have, the kind of the Iowa lottery type thing. If they get the big one, they get that. $5, whoa. Or a dot-to-dot program. You draw a picture of something that the parents are willing to give the kid and the kid wants with dots. Every day they do or don't do the thing of interest, connect two of the dots. When the dots are all connected, buy them the thing. They can earn privileges, or you can build reinforcers out of bedtime. How do you do that? Set one. My first question with all families is, what's the bedtime? And I always get a theory. We'd like it to be. All right, well, what is it? Okay, we'd like it to be 9. What is it? Well, it's probably around 10. Okay, so that's the sweet spot for the kids. They love 10. Parents can live with 10, but they want 9. Enforce 9. Now we got that hour between 9 and 10, because they can live with that. They've shown that, and we can divide that up into 15-minute blocks or what have you and deliver those as rewards. And the kids want those minutes and work for them. So lots of ways to create rewards and incentives. Exposure-based treatments. You got escape extinction. We invented that. That's ours. Then you got exposure response prevention. That is the cornerstone of the field known as cognitive behavior therapy, the most popular form of psychology in the world. And if you took exposure and response prevention away from cognitive behavior therapy, there would be no cognitive behavior therapy. And what is exposure and response prevention? Well, gosh darn it, it's escape extinction. It's just, we're so bad at marketing stuff. But other fields are better at this, and so they come over and they see our stuff, and they kind of like, oh. And they rename it and market it. And now they get the credit. Systematic desensitization, same thing. Behavioral and emotional inoculation, same thing. It's all escape extinction. So here's some real life examples. So turns out a lot of people are anxious about cats, afraid of cats, and they engage in some pretty inappropriate forms of misbehavior when it comes to cats. Yeah. So in our program, we start with distal exposure, and then we move to proximal exposure, and then the terminal step in the program. If we can get the person to complete this step, the program is always successful. Here it is. Yeah. So some kids are afraid of falling into the toilet because they've seen stuff go in. They've never seen it come back out again. And they see that they would fit. So in our exposure program, we'll sit them over the aperture and hold them. Then we'll close the aperture, let them sit on it, bring a friend. And then we'll sit them over the aperture while they support themselves and distract them by reading. And then in our terminal stage, the terminal stage of this program, which if they pass this step, they always are successful for the rest of their life. Here it is. A lot of kids, as it turns out, are afraid of creepy crawlies. And in our program, we introduce them to very tiny creepy crawlies, and then larger creepy crawlies, but distally, then proximally, and then we have a terminal stage, and if they pass this stage again, we're very successful. Here it is. So let's get some actual examples. So these data are from a study of a very unfortunate 15-year-old boy came to Boys Town. And it turned out he had a comorbid condition of Tourette's syndrome and obsessive compulsive disorder. And the people at Boys Town didn't know about either condition. And they were going to terminate his placement. And that's a bad thing to happen. Terminating a kid from a residential care program is a major, major downward step. And the down that they're going to is not even worth considering. So I always advocated to let me get involved with my staff. We're going to terminate somebody to see if we could find something clinical we might be able to work out. And so we did our assessment, and we told them, no, this poor kid, he's suffering from Tourette's syndrome and obsessive compulsive disorder. Now, in Tourette's syndrome, what you have are the co-occurrence of vocal and motor tics. If you have somebody with vocal and motor tics, and they're not caused by some biological condition, that's Tourette's syndrome. It's pretty simple to diagnose. And it's a lifelong neurological disease with no known cure. We can modify it, but we can't cure it. And there are 5 classes of tics that are kind of unusual. They don't determine the diagnosis, but if they're present, they verify it. One you've probably heard of before if you've heard of Tourette's syndrome, and it's called coprolalia, which means naughty talk, like obscene speech. There's also copropraxia, which is obscene gestures, and echolalia, which is repeating what somebody else has said, and echopraxia, which is mimicking what somebody else did. This is what he had. And then the last one is palilalia, which is repeating yourself. So he had echopraxia. And it involved somebody touching their own chest. So if somebody was talking and they touched their chest, he would be compelled to go and touch their chest too. But when he did it with our boys handled it perfectly well. They just shoved him or whatever, punched him. But our girls, a lot of our girls have been sexually abused. And so when they touched their chest, he would touch their chest if they were in proximity. But remember, he's also got obsessive compulsive disorder. Remember what that is. It's not quite right syndrome. So he touched their chest, and that wasn't quite right. So he touched it again, and again, and again, and stopped me before this becomes groping. See, that's what it looked like. And so here we have this data. And you can see, I don't know, you can see that this is not experimental data. It's not even A-B data. It's just B. But those data are published in the premier child and adolescent psychiatry journal in the world. Why would they publish that kind of a data set? Because the findings were so unique. Because I had one of our female interns sit in front of him and touch her chest. And when he went to touch her chest, he'd block his hand. Exposure and response prevention, escape, extinction. Until finally he just lost interest in touching her chest. It completely went away. Now, we got those published in a psychiatry journal. I know I was surprised that it happened, but I'm glad for the story. But we got another kid with the same pattern. This time we did it right and embedded it in a true experimental design, and those data were published in Java. Now here's a nice young man, handsome young man. Looks like he's going for a job interview. Here's his clinical description. He had above average IQ. He was suspicious of adults, socially anxious, pervasive fear of public failure, really, really uncomfortable with attention, and controlling and manipulative. And here he is as an adult. So let's go back here. So this is when he was at Boys Town. He's just a kid. I got his psychiatric file. I have his psychiatric file. You know what I mean? Do you guys recognize this person? It's Charles Manson. So I have his psychiatric file from when he was 14. And I also have his psychiatric file from when he was 57. I've been doing research in this area, and these people at 60 Minutes got the idea that, or found out about it, and wanted me to, go on 60 Minutes and talk about the research. They were really interested in hearing about Charles Manson, and I told them I wouldn't do it unless they got permission from Charles Manson for me to talk about him publicly that way. And so the producer that was trying to get me to come on camera went to Folsom, got a meeting with Charles Manson, but Manson would be under siege in the prison frequently. So many different elements of the prison wanted to kill him that if he felt threatened, he would either burn his mattress or flood his cell, and then they'd put him in lockdown. And while the producer was at 60 Minutes, he went into lockdown, so he didn't get his meeting. So he bribed a guard and got the file, and thought, if he gave me the file, maybe I would, be persuaded. Well, I wasn't persuaded, but I got the file. Anyway, so the basic point of this is, though, like, his psychiatrist said when he was 14, like, this kid is, they didn't have the term social anxiety back then, is a very anxious person, and he has resorted to being controlling and manipulative with other people in order to keep his psychiatric trouble manageable. But it's becoming a lifestyle with him, and if this doesn't get managed, this could have deleterious effects on his future and maybe the future of people around him. Whoa. So, but the thing is, this is just a kid. This is not a monster. Now, this is a monster. But as a result of things that happened to him over the course of life from here to here. Anyway, so now I know about this condition. It's a combination of social phobia and conduct disorder. And the conduct has that avoidant escapist function to it. And it ends up being controlling and manipulative. And so we identified a kid on our campus that had a similar pattern of behavior. He was acting out in a way that was going to get him expelled from Boys Town. And the acting out involved him taking swings at his family teacher. The family teachers are off limits. You don't punch a family teacher. They're sacred beings. We don't even get to argue with them. But I got involved. I said, let me find out what's going on here. This doesn't make sense given the kid's history. So we did our own assessment, and I determined this kid was really, really, really anxious. And he particularly didn't like anything done in public. And the point finds and point awards that are done in our system are often done publicly. And so I just went to everybody that was involved with him at our schools and his coaches and his family teachers and just said, from this point forward, do your teaching interactions with him privately, like you would with an adult. And they did, and everything went to zero, as you can see there, and we published these data in a major journal. This involves insect phobia. The kid involved was being really disruptive in our middle school. And the thing he was afraid of were ladybugs and crickets. And once the other kids found out, you think that they went out of their way to make sure there were no ladybugs or crickets in the classroom? No. They'd go and catch them and bring them in. Or they just taunt them and say, there's some in your desk. And, you know, this kid would just wig out and run. He'd knock people down, knock over his desk, and nobody knew how to interpret it. And so I decided we're going to do an exposure program, and I went to look for where can I get ladybugs. And you can buy ladybugs, but you got to buy 1,000 at a time. So that's too many ladybugs for me. But you can buy crickets one at a time because people feed them to their tarantulas. Why would you have a tarantula? I guess you're just getting over the fear of spiders. So when we think of crickets, you know, we think of something pretty harmless, like Jiminy Cricket. But when he thought of crickets, I think he was thinking of something quite a bit more hideous. So in our exposure steps, here they are. We start out just holding a jar with crickets and end up, the terminal step was holding a cricket in each hand for 20 seconds. Try to imagine that. I mean, that even creeps me out. I know they don't bite, but I think I know they don't bite. I mean, you don't know. They got the little thing, and they've got all those legs going like this. But he did it. So that's his exposure program. And this is what you need to know about exposure. He helped us pick these steps. These steps aren't to be thrust on someone. The steps have to be steps they are ready, willing, and able to pursue. Not something that we think they should be ready, willing, and able to pursue. They should be consciously involved in the picking of all their steps. And if there's a step that they say they can't do, then divide it into smaller steps or get rid of it. So he picked all of these. We use this, you know, to measure the steps. So let me go back over this. I'll just show you what we have here. Now, what's really interesting about this study is we didn't measure anxiety here. That data involves completed math problems. What we're looking at is performance. You know, anxiety, remember, is a category. I mean, they measure it using all these psychiatric checklists as if it actually exists as a phenomenon, when we're just interested in the behavior that's affected. And so we have them do math problems under 3 conditions. Bugs are present. We said bugs were present, and no bugs are present. So there's no bugs. So get a high level of math problems completed there. I went into the room, I check it thoroughly, I'd say, I'll call him Tommy. Hey Tommy, there's no crickets in here, there's no bugs in here of any kind. Please do your math problems. And so we'd start doing them. Then under this condition, I'd go in and look around the room, and I'd go, you know what, buddy? There's some bugs in here somewhere. Please do your math problems. And the third one is, I'd go in there, I have 2 crickets, I threw them on the floor, right where you could see them, and I say, please do your math problems. And he would instantly hop up on a desk and do them like this. I mean, he was totally freaked out by these bugs. And so you see that you get a decrement in performance there. Then we start our program, and look at that. We're just going right up, and then, what's going on? We don't know. But this is where I'm talking about incentives. We're asking him to do math problems. We're not giving him anything for it. I think he just got sick of doing math. So I made a deal with the guy. I said, you start completing your math problems, I'll give you X number of points per problem. And that's when it really took off. So here we are at the end of the program. And serendipitously, my research partner, Kevin Jones, went over to visit the classroom about 3 weeks after the study. The kid doesn't know he's in the back of the class, and he watches as one of the kids in the class had thrown a cricket underneath his desk. And the kid, the subject in our study, he goes up and gets a tissue, comes back, exterminates the cricket, and takes it and puts it in a waste bag, and goes back and just completes his work at his desk, completely cured him of that. So again, what I'm promoting here is the exposure and the response prevention, also using performance as your primary dependent measure rather than a bunch of secondary measures of anxiety, unless, you know, for the you folks that have scientific ambitions and you want to get your work into mainstream journals, you usually have to throw in some kind of a hypothetical deductive measure in there somewhere, some kind of a constructional measure and a statistic. It isn't necessary really to produce any kind of finding that's necessary for the kind of things we work on. sometimes it's necessary to meet the contingencies of the people that are editing the journal. So here's typical treatment. Demystify the whole concept, which is what I've been striving to do since I got up here. And then change parenting and caregiving practices. Name it. Then exposure steps, incentive, relaxation, breathing skills, and sell it. Sell it. It has to be sold. Bear in mind, the person in front of you has designed their life to not have this experience. And now we're telling them the only way out is through. In order to get over this thing that you have bothering you, you have to have this thing that's bothering you. And so that's where I sometimes question the whole empirically supported treatment movement. Just giving them the treatment steps without any kind of a campaign to persuade them to follow those steps doesn't seem like it would really go anywhere. And I've spent 35 years of my career, I got this old joke, turning screws 10 cents, knowing which screw to turn, $49.90. And so let's say turning screws 10 cents, convincing the person in front of me to turn that screw, $49.90. So a very small part of my work involves giving people advice. And the majority of my work involves persuading them to follow that advice, and especially when it involves anxiety. Now, I have a closing statement, but I can take questions. And I want you to know that the last time I said what I just now said was so long ago, I can't even remember it. I never take questions. I always end a talk on a universal theme and try to get out of the room as fast as I can. Because I want a presentation to be a complete product, and I don't necessarily want somebody to ask me questions that won't have any interest for the rest of the people in the audience and will probably divert from my universal point. But I haven't made a universal point, and I thought I'd save a little time for questions in case you have any. Yeah. I'll repeat it for you.
Is it 5-1?
Yeah.
Can we get too big, like 10-1? Is that detrimental association?
Let's see if this works. No? Is that working? No, this one's working. Hey, it's working. Why does it work for you? Okay, the question is, for the 5-to-1 ratio, if it skyrockets, say up to 10 or 15-to-1, would that be detrimental? And empirically speaking, I don't know, but my opinion is no, it wouldn't hurt a thing. That's what unconditional positive regard is. So it doesn't hurt a relationship to have ongoing pleasant stuff happening between the two people. It's just that it seems almost impossible unless your names are Romeo and Juliet, to have a relationship where there isn't a periodic unpleasant interaction. So the part that needs to be programmed isn't the unpleasant part. That'll just naturally occur. The part that needs to be programmed is the pleasant part, and you can get that up as high as you want. But as long as what appears to be the magical ratio, meaning this is a very protective ratio, is anything 5-to-1 or higher. Thank you for the question. Yeah, let me see if I don't have my glasses on, so I'll get her and then I'll get you. Yes. Is anxiety hereditary? My opinion, yes. It's so much so that when a parent brings an anxious kid to me and the parents are sitting there, once we get to know each other pretty well, I'll go, which one of you married badly? And then I'll clean it up, and say, look, this is something he inherited from one of you or one of your family trees, and that person inherited from somebody else, and they inherited from somebody else. There's no other way to explain what's in front of us unless this kid has had a really, really traumatic history. Because like a very traumatic history, a very neglectful history can create an anxiety condition. That is rarely going to be the case for my clients. And it isn't going to account for that 31%. but it'll account for like a fraction of that percent. But in most cases, it's a hereditary thing. It's the same thing with bedwetting. I do the same question. Bedwetting is inherited. I'll look, which one of you married badly? Kidding. No, yeah. I have my own way of creating rapport. I'm not recommending it for you. You'll have to do it your way. Yes.
Question we were talking about, just for instance, timeouts.
Yeah.
My son has Asperger's, and he doesn't associate one thing with another. So we're having trouble getting him to understand consequences because it's difficult for him to associate, for instance, a punishment with an action that he's doing. Do you have any recommendations for that, or am I being clear?
You've been clear.
Okay.
I don't accept your premise.
Oh, good. That's even better.
Because you can teach it. She's asking me, saying that her son doesn't make associations very well. He doesn't associate behaviors with their consequences very well. But single-celled organisms can be taught associations.
No, well, I mean, with obvious consequences, like he dropped his cookie on the floor in the dirt, and now the cookie's gone. But I mean, when he is, when we're trying to give him a consequence of an action, for instance, he lies. I'm just randomly talking.
Yeah.
So he lies, and then we're trying, like, obviously, to take a snack away from him.
For lying?
Pardon me?
For lying?
For lying.
It makes a difference. You're not going to teach a human being not to lie. Ever.
Well, obviously, but I mean, when you, for instance, if, I guess I'm not being clear, if he is lying to you when you're like dead obvious that he's doing something,
Yeah.
I guess what I'm trying to figure out is how the best way to make sure, I guess, the punishment fits the crime, so that he can understand.
Well, it depends on what the crime is. You're not going to teach him not to lie. You're not going to teach him not to lie blatantly to your face. This is a room full of liars. You know how I know that? They're human beings. Human beings lie. You see these clothes? They are a lie. I'm hiding what I actually am. Inside here is a naked body that I don't want you to know anything about. So the association is going to be very hard to develop when it comes to that kind of abstract behavior that is prevalent throughout most of his day. And kids, I like the idea of lying because parents are always asking me, why does my kid lie? Is he, what's the matter? Is he dishonest? And I'm like, no, he lies because it works.
I just picked lying because it was random.
It makes a difference what you pick.
Okay.
So he makes associations, or he wouldn't be alive. But some of the associations that you want him to make, he's not making.
Correct.
And it could be that there are very complicated behaviors like lying that have an extended network of reinforcing contingencies outside of your control. Or it could be the timing of the consequence. Or it could be that the behavior that you're trying to target has other rich sources of reinforcement that outweigh the impact of the punishment that you've selected. But I'm skeptical about him not making associations. Even if, I'm not saying he's profoundly delayed, but even if he were, he's still making associations. But I do think the punishment should fit the crime. I'm more in favor of repetition than I am big, high-impact punishments, so that it's like an economical decision over time. Like gradually, the kid decides, oh, it's just not worth it anymore. But that could take time and patience.
What we're actually working on right now is for him to help us, because he's going to turn 11. So we're having him help us choose what the consequence of certain things are.
Yep. She's saying she sometimes has her son help pick the consequence for his misbehavior, which I kind of like in typically developing teenagers. I'm not sure about persons on the spectrum because I don't know. But with typically developing teenagers, they often pick a far worse punishment than their parents would pick. It's like, what if I just chop off my finger? Well, I was just thinking staying in for the night, but But yes, I think it's a good idea to have them to participate in that. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Let's see. I'll go here and here, and then I'll come back there.
I just, when you were talking about medication and talking to your coworkers about medication.
Yeah.
I just want to know what your feelings are on all these new gene site tests that are coming out to test people genetically to see what their medication, what medication is for them.
What's that? Oh, okay. So she's asking me about the genetics, the so-called genetic test for the susceptibility to certain medications, so they have some kind of matching. Yeah. I think it's a great way for physicians to get one more revenue stream. Well, it has to work scientifically. It hasn't been.
I run a support group. I've had 15 parents. I know it's a small subject matter area, but 15 parents have done it. Out of the 15, 14 found that their child was not on the right medication, switched it and had success, and the one that didn't have to switch it was because she was on the correct medication to begin with.
Okay. Well, it's got possibility. Are you advocating for it? Okay. Yes.
So when you gave tips to professionals and caregivers for working with
Wait, this works now.
So you shared a slide with tips for professionals
Yeah.
and caregivers,
Yeah.
and talked about incorporating intense or unusual interests, and kind of like deciding, well, is this something that's harmful? No, then we can privatize it, like
Yeah,
the
yeah.
stimming example you gave. And then you also were talking about versus kind of on the obsessive compulsive side, there are some compulsive behaviors that we want to use exposure and response therapy to kind of eliminate those because they create so much anxiety in the client. If I'm kind of seeing, so how do you distinguish between the two types of behaviors, whether this is something that we want to...
The function. The compulsion has an avoidant function for a certain, like, bodily, psychological, emotional state. And avoidance is the enemy. The other behavior it's got a, like, maybe not avoidance, it's the actual stimulation, I think, that is the reinforcer. It's like automatically reinforcing in a positive way. I think there's a fine line there. I mean, scratching an itch is an automatically reinforced behavior, but it's negative reinforcement, but it's also positive reinforcement because it feels good. It also eliminates an irritation. So it's got both functions. But mainly the function. The compulsion is designed to eliminate a irrational fear state. And as long as the compulsion stays in place, then whatever the stimuli that caused the fear state to begin with remain a fearful set of stimuli. And we remember, anxiety is being afraid of stuff that's not dangerous, but we can't convince them that it's not dangerous by talking to them. So we want them to experience that it's not dangerous. But if they use compulsions in order to avoid experiencing it, then they never learn the lesson. Am I answering your question?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. That's you.
so my question is, for a person who has anxiety in general, do you think it's important? I kind of feel like some people who may have anxiety, it may be harder for them because they may feel like their panic attacks or whatever is happening to them, it shouldn't be happening. Like, it shouldn't be part of their day.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be anything
Yeah.
like that. So do you think it's important for that particular person to know, like, hey, anxiety isn't something that's just going to go away. It's more so focusing on what you can do in spite of instead of trying to cure and get rid of it.
I do. I think that that's been kind of the campaign that I've had here, is anxiety in and of itself is not the enemy. It can be very, very useful. It's just that in large, large doses, so to speak, then it's detrimental. Like anything else, you can get too much of a good thing. I think the campaign that has been I don't know, conducted ever since Freud has made anxiety seem like it's a bad thing, and people feel like there's something wrong with them if they experience it. And it's absolutely transformative when people start to embrace the way they actually are, instead of trying to be different than the way they actually are. A person that has an anxious temperament is going to have an anxious temperament. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with them. It does mean that we have to figure out how can we plug that anxious temperament into a lifestyle that really works for them. And I have a naturally anxious temperament, and I picked a lifestyle that fits my anxious temperament. I would make a terrible Secretary of Defense. But having an anxious temperament actually makes doing clinical psychology very suitable for me. And actually anything that requires a certain dose of compassion seems to fit my temperament perfectly. So I look for, and I think that's true for, I would imagine, just about everybody in this room. Okay. We'll come to you next. Sorry, it's going to be inequitable.
My son is now, he has autism. He does
Yeah.
the writing of his fingers, and he does it 24 hours a day. And he does it to the point where he breaks his skin and he's bleeding. But I don't know what's causing him to do that because it's all day long. He's just sitting there, he's writing, he's walking, he's writing.
Yeah.
But I don't know what to do to stop him from writing and breaking his skin.
Well, I don't either. Although there's some options. I haven't worked on that self-biting before, but I've worked on trichotillomania before, which is compulsive hair pulling, in children too young to persuade to stop. And so what we would use are mild forms of restraints or increased effort, or we'd like have them wear a glove so they couldn't get the tactile sensation of touching their hair. So for him, if you could keep that hand, I don't know, covered in some way so he couldn't get to the skin, because the reinforcer is in the sensation that he experiences as he bites, then he might lose interest in that behavior. But this is not an area of expertise of mine. And that's not the kind of behavior I would say, let him do it, because it's obviously got self-harm attached to it. Somebody back here had a question? Yeah.
Just wondering if you could share one of the most influential texts in your career, book, and then a book recommendation you might have for the audience following your presentation today.
A book? A website? Is it? Books. Books! Well, I'd recommend a book by Ed Christopherson called Treatments for Children That Work. And there's a section on anxiety in that book. And also a section on incontinence, and a section on ADHD, and a section on disruptive behavior and non-compliance. Just a useful, practical clinical text. Ed Christopherson, the founder of behavioral pediatrics in primary care. Pardon me? I don't. Boys Town does, but I don't. No Facebook page, no Twitter account. From Montana. We don't even have the whole alphabet out there, not to mention. I could take a couple more questions. Yes, let's get this section over here, and we'll come over there.
So you said behavior analysts aren't really addressing anxiety and autism. There's very little research on interventions for...
Where are you?
Right here.
Oh, here.
Very little research, it seems, on autism and OCD behavior. Do you know of any really good articles, or if any research is being done right now on OCD behavior and autism?
On OCD and autism?
Yes.
No, I don't. Louis Hagopian has been doing some research on anxiety and autism. So has Simon Diamond and Bill Ahern. Those are the three people I know that work with persons on the spectrum that have started to do research just in the general area of anxiety. Whether any of it pertains to OCD specifically, I don't know. But for the longest time, there wasn't anything from behavior analysis in general, and now it's starting to veer into the spectrum population. But I would think it would probably be more prevalent, because at some point it might be hard to distinguish OCD from some of those ritualistic, stereotypical behaviors. What's pardon me?
It seems that that's all the research is on that we can find is on repetitive behavior, like stimming.
Yeah, they're still not blending it into the anxiety category, but I expect that will happen. Or maybe you could make it happen.
Can you repeat the names?
Oh, Bill Ahern, Simon Diamond,
Lewis.
and Louis Hagopian. Okay, I promised somebody over here. Yes. Can we get her?
I was trying to tell him how to spell Hagopian.
Do you think the case can ever be made for skipping steps in a systematic desensitization?
I had that on a slide. I didn't say anything about it. So, you got the question? So, what I have is a promise and a go for. The promise I expect to be completed. That's the step we've agreed upon. But I also want to know, but what do you want to go for? So that if they decide to go for it, they can. They could skip the step because they were going to go for it. But I don't hold them accountable for a go for. But I always want people to be working for a little bit more than they promised to do. So that would be like the next step. But it's up to them, not up to us.
What about a client that doesn't quite have that cognitive ability?
Use pictures. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I'll repeat it. So what about a client that doesn't have that kind of cognitive ability? I guess I would use pictures. Again, bear in mind, there's a room full of experts here, and they're all in the back of the room. And there's one non-expert here, and he's in the front of the room. So some of these things I don't know that well. So I'm not exactly sure how you parlay a limited cognitive ability into a systematic desensitization program that requires cooperation. But I would think if you use pictures, it might be helpful.
Well, it sounds like you're still letting the client make the choice.
Totally.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, let's let her.
What's your opinion on using a service dog to help anxiety?
Oh, look at the time. Whoa. It's just getting away from me here. Okay. I'd like to be agnostic on the question, but I'll tell you why. Because not everybody that has a service dog needs a service dog. And the service dogs aren't neutral organisms. You know, they're occupying space where other people are, like on planes or in enclosed spaces. And if the person that has the dog has a bona fide need for the dog and actually can't perform out in the world without that dog, well, we want them out in the world. But, you know, people are abusing this system because who doesn't want to have a dog, you know, with them on a day-to-day basis? And I just happen to be in a profession that is recruited to try and create a need for service dogs. Because they'll come to us and ask us to establish a bona fide need for a service dog. And there's just been too many attempts to manipulate us and maybe defraud us. And so I just want to, I've decided that my practice, the Center for Behavioral Health at Boys Town, is not going to get into the service dog industry. That's why I want to be agnostic on it. But I watched a young woman leaving a shopping center last week, and she was melting down. And she had a dog, but her parents were walking it, and it was all they could do to get her out of that shopping center. And I thought, that poor woman is just being held together by like little bits of string and some sealing wax. And if what it takes for her to get out into the world and experience people in life is that dog, then she should have that dog. But I watched a big burly guy yesterday at the airport with this German Shepherd, and he wasn't a policeman. It was a service dog, and I thought, why would he need a service dog? I mean, maybe there's something about him I couldn't see. But he walked confidently and robustly, maybe because he had the dog. There wasn't anything about him that made it seem like he was barely holding himself together. And I thought maybe he just scammed the system because he wants to bring his dog with him wherever he goes. So that's why I'm kind of agnostic on the subject. Okay, did I answer your question?
Yes.
Thanks for, like, trying to get me to step in it. You pick.
In the example you gave about the individual who was very socially anxious, and because that was very aggressive, how going about teasing that out seems to be a very difficult process, I would imagine. And then also getting buy-in from staff is one thing I would look at, going, oh no, don't punish or reinforce or anything publicly, and doing that privately. Can you talk more about that?
Well, that kid had a bona fide case of social phobia. And public interactions just really, really made him nervous. And they had overdone it. I think it's an epidemic with teenagers. I think adults, and especially high school teachers, for some reason think it's fine to just to call a kid out publicly in front of their peers, in front of the rest of the class. And there isn't a time in life when that's worse. There isn't a worse time in life for that. I mean, those kids' egos are so fragile at that point in their life, and they're so worried about how they show up around their peers, and they so have to suffer like the cajoling and the teasings of their peers. And for a teacher or an adult to add to that by doing public stuff with them, it just, and I remember it. I mean, when I was a sophomore in high school, I had a teacher. I like this guy, so I'm going to tell you his name. He's a good teacher. But he did tease me in public. And his name was Jerry Friett. And I was a cut-up in the back of the class. And so one day in class, he just yells out, "Mr. Fryman, if I want any crap out of you, I'll squeeze your head," like that. You know, I can't let this stand. I would be hearing it in the hallway for the rest of the, "Hey, Fryman, bring your head over here. I need some crap." You know, like that. So this guy, Jerry Friett, he doesn't say his R's very well. So it really came out, "Mr. Fryman, if I want any crap out of you, I'll squeeze your head." And I went, "All right, Mr. Friett, I'll be very careful," like that. So 3-day suspension. But I was a hero for like a month. So he shouldn't have done that. You know, I mean, he's a cool teacher. Other things he did with me are great. But in general, I think we need to be sensitive to how sensitive these kids are to public attention. You can see them kind of fold in on themselves sometimes when we start to talk to them in front of other people. Just be sensitive to that. Am I answering your question? Yeah. One more.
Hi, this question is actually kind of similar to one that you already answered, but it's probably very hard to determine if a client has anxious behavior and also has compulsions.
Yeah.
What's causing that? There's a particular client. Like, what would be your process if you had a client that really, really liked to manipulate things, switches, doorknobs, levers, all that kind of fidgety stuff, and he seems to really, really like it.
Yeah.
But he's also a very anxious child. How can you determine?
There'd be an overlap. I think there'd be an overlap, but, you know, the stuff that you mentioned really doesn't sound that harmful.
Privatize that, though.
I'm not necessarily saying privatize all of it. That doesn't sound that necessarily weird to me. You might just let him do that and get him stuff because he's interested in switches. Like, get a revolving credit card for Home Depot. No, there's a kid that I consult to a program. Actually, I end up in the autism community a lot, surprisingly. I'm on the board of advisors for an autism program, and the owner of the program has a son on the spectrum, and he's totally into fans. He knows more about fans, I think, than anybody that ever lived. What's wrong with that? Like, I'm going to need a ceiling fan before long, and he's the guy I'm going to call. So there probably is an overlap there in that he gets some comfort from occupying his thoughts with these things that are interesting to him, and he probably is more compelled to do it when he's feeling like anxious or upset. But sometimes he just does it because he likes it. Yeah, very much so. Yeah. Rhythmic behaviors will often be calming on some level. Yeah. That's all I have time. I haven't done that in so long. I can't remember the last time I did it. Oh, I don't need this. I've got my own microphone. You know, I guess I want to make a case for the field of behavior analysis, and insofar as what it has to say about things like anxiety. It's not a very popular field, not widely accepted or known. I mean, I know that it's pretty accepted in this room, but not accepted very far and wide outside of the narrow field that it is. It's not even a very dominant force in psychology. Though I do believe, along with Martin Luther King, that the arc of the universe will bend towards truth and justice, and then ultimately it'll be discovered. But I think one of the things we could do to heighten the frequency or the velocity of that is just be better at marketing this stuff. One of the things that my advisor, Montrose Wolf, specialized in was what was called social validity, and we need to pay more attention to what people find acceptable, rather than just insisting that people do the stuff that we think will work really, really well before we've ever tested whether they find that acceptable. And sometimes that'll require, packaging. And I think in certain domains, we understand packaging exceptionally well. I don't know if you know this or not, but negligees have nothing to do with conception. Not in any way, shape, or form. But they do add a little something to the entire process, and maybe even be correlated with more conception. So that's packaging. A lot of people in my world drink bottled water. You know anybody like that? And here's what they've discovered scientifically. They've discovered this. Bottled water is almost, it's very close, almost as safe as tap water. Why is everybody drinking it? Because of marketing. Now, if you can market water to people that isn't quite as safe as the water in their house, this means you're marketing nothing. But behavior analysis, it has something. It really has something. So what's missing? It's not the stuff. We got the stuff. What's missing is the marketing of the stuff. And so it's just a field that needs to do a better job of marketing its wares, because we really have the wares and we have the people. So anyway, thank you so much for your attention. Thank you for being here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fryman. Thank you for giving us another way to analyze anxiety and some more tools in our toolbox to help us deal with this every day. All right, so the session number is number 8, and you can go on the Groupio app and give an evaluation if you would like, and give us feedback. We would appreciate that. The session code for today is ZIP as in zip. ZIP 912. All right, thank you.